30, 35 feet shooting.
And that will take down a person?
It will blind them to or incapacitate them. If they come in the bedroom door or bedroom window, I can incapacitate them.
That's interesting. I know bear spray can do that. That's why they were using that against the police in Washington,
right,
D.C.
The hornet spray is a stream that goes up into the rafters to get the hornet's nest, and it'll get somebody's face.
It's also a poison. You know, I mean, it's a neurotoxin, isn't it?
Won't kill them. If you're being
attacked, it won't kill a human being.
Right.
Yeah. I can't advocate for that because, Bob, thank you for the call. God only knows what it would do. But it's interesting. I mean, you know, there are alternatives to having guns in your home, I guess, is the bottom line. Anyhow, fascinating conversation. Let's see.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Gabi.com. Gabi takes the pain out of shopping for insurance. More info at Gabi.com/Tom. Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Health. More info at teethhealth.com, code Tom. HelloFresh, delivering fresh ingredients and mouthwatering recipes. More info at hellofresh.com, code Tom. Bowl and Branch, crafted for the common good. More information at bowlandbranch.com, code Tom. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More info at expressvpn.com/Tom. And CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code Tom.
We're reading today from Truth in Our Times by David E. McCraw, Deputy General Counsel of the New York Times, the #2 lawyer for the New York Times. This is in Chapter 1, titled Election Day. It opens with a tweet from Donald Trump. The failing New York Times has been wrong about me from the very beginning. Sadly, I would lose the primaries. Oh, said I would lose the primaries on the general election. Fake news. November 8, 2016. At 10 p.m., I made one last circuit of the newsroom. Our CEO, Mark Thompson, stood near the political desk, looking on with his wife and a small group of others connected somehow to the Times. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan remained in doubt, but the reality was sinking in. Donald Trump was on the verge of winning the American presidency. I'd been in newsrooms on election nights before. I know how it's supposed to be. The only thing that ever mattered was the horse race, think Gore-Bush, or the historic moment, think Obama-McCain. There was no investment in which candidate was winning. He or she was destined to disappoint in the long run. And the dominant emotion was a certain not quite cynical detachment amid the electric buzz of the vote count and projections and the anticipation of relief that the endless push of the campaign was finally over. Sure, you couldn't ignore the victories or the big picture moments, and the day after stories would be celebratory in their way, duly restrained, but with a nod to victory itself. Not unlike the next day account of a Super Bowl game or Game 7 of the World Series. Capture the triumph for a night or relish the race too close to call. Leave the dancing and crying for others, for the believers. But this night was like no other election night. There had been an investment, not just journalistic, but spiritual. Donald Trump had campaigned not just against Hillary Clinton, but also against the New York Times and the American press, the mainstream American press. And his astonishing rise to the top of the Republican Party had been built on his near daily attacks on facts, on the very idea that facts matter. For journalists who approach truth like a secular religion and who have seen 1,000 times how a single true story could gut the political career of a lying politician, it had been a year of faith-shaking disbelief. A line had not just been crossed, but obliterated. The shock was palpable as the numbers came in, laced for some with the fading hope for a different outcome among people who generally wanted nothing more than a story worth telling. And there was still a paper to put out, a reckoning to account for. It was too much on an already long night. I slipped away. At the elevators, I ran into Sue Craig and a guy who was obviously not from the Times. Sue had broken one of the biggest stories of the campaign. She was the one who went to her mailbox one day in September and found pages from Donald Trump's tax returns in an envelope. She introduced me to her acquaintance. He had once worked for Trump. I didn't ask why he was there. Like me, Sue had decided to get away. "It's too weird here," she said. We all got on the elevator. Sue, who had written a devastating story about Trump, me, whose letter to Trump's lawyers had lit up the internet for a week in October, and one of Trump's guys. We rode in silence, a strange tableau on the strangest night of the year. 14 hours earlier, as I came into the building, the Times security guard had called me over. They wanted to make sure I knew about the plans for the next morning. In the quirky ways that things happen at the Times, I had become the lawyer to see for all the things that security guys encountered, from the intruder who pilfered women's shoes to the anonymous letter weaponized with razor blades. The Times was printing thousands of extra newspapers, and tables were going to be set up outside for all the people who would be showing up to buy the New York Times for posterity's sake. The headline, I later learned, was going to read, "Madam President." We had been caught flat-footed 8 years earlier when Barack Obama had made history. By the time I arrived for work early in the morning of the 2008 election, the line was already starting to snake down the sidewalk. Soon there were hundreds of Obama supporters who thought, and why wouldn't they, that the place to buy a copy of the New York Times was surely at the New York Times. Lots of things happen at the Times building. Selling newspapers is not one of them. Employees were pressed into emergency duty to cart bundles of newspapers from the Times printing plant in Queens, and the long lines outside the building stretched on into the afternoon. But it was Obama's victory in 2012 that was on my mind this morning. I vote in a neighborhood that is predominantly black and middle class. In 2012, following a drumbeat of stories about how Republicans hoped to suppress voter turnout, I walked into my polling place at a local school 8 minutes after it opened. The line already extended back to the schoolhouse door. "Did y'all sleep here?" a guy wanted to know as he stepped into the foyer. On this morning in 2016, I had arrived before dawn. I was the only one in line at my precinct's table. That all seemed like a strangely distant memory as midnight approached. I had made my escape from the building with Sue and the Trump guy. At home, I sat alone in the glow of the TV screens as the states that mattered fell into place for the Republicans. I turned it off. Donald Trump was about to become president of the United States. The next morning, in a light drizzle on a gray November day, the newspaper sales tables were set up outside the building as planned. No one stopped. The vendors sat idly amid the stacks. There was no Madam President front page. Instead, the headline read, "Trump Triumphs," and the first two paragraphs of the lead story talked about how the vote threatened convulsions throughout the country and made an early mention of those who had watched with alarm the rise of Trump. Nearly half the country had voted for the man. I had just spent a weekend in October back in rural Illinois, in my hometown, and for a moment I allowed myself to see the coverage through the eyes of the rest of America, where, at least for this one night, his victory represented a certain kind of hope that change was going to come at last. Truth in Our Times by David McCraw.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Wow, this week is just flying past. Happy Thursday. Thom Hartmann here with you. In the second hour of our program today, Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by. We're going to talk about the economics of mass shootings and police shootings, which I think is going to be fascinating. In our third hour, Debbie Hines, a brilliant legal analyst who has been on our program many times over the years, is coming back to talk about the Chauvin trial. I think that's how it's pronounced, Chauvin. The cop who murdered George Floyd. The trial of the, that's really how we should be saying it. The cop who murdered George Floyd's trial in Minneapolis, and the larger issue, this whole larger issue of the presumed innocence of whiteness, right? White mass shooters are almost always, well, for example, the other day, day before yesterday, somebody tweeted, the shooter must be a white guy. He was brought in alive, right? I mean, it's just like, okay. So anyhow, we're going to get into that in our third hour. But in the first hour, I wanted to lay out for you this piece that I started working on last night. I kind of added pieces to it through the evening as Louise and I were watching an old Cagney and Lacey. And Louise and I finished it up this morning and published it over at HartmannReport.com. And it's titled, Dear Republican Voter, what did you expect, right? When Ted Nugent and the NRA and the GOP told you that more guns in America would provide us with a safer, less violent society, what did you expect, Republican voters? I mean, seriously, did you think that suddenly every person in America was going to turn into a marksman and some kind of Wild West movie fantasy was going to be the outcome? Really? When Trump said that COVID was just like the flu, at the same time that he was telling Bob Woodward that it was a killer, what did you expect? I mean, when he pushed refusing to wear a mask like it was some sort of declaration of masculinity and openly encouraged states and cities to stay open in the face of this pandemic in order to give us herd thinking, did you really think it would keep 500,000 Americans from dying? When Trump sent thousands of modern-day brown shirts to storm the U.S. Capitol and try to kill Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi so Trump could become the nation's first strongman dictator, what did you expect, Republicans? Did you really believe that American democracy was outdated, that our country would be better run by a billionaire oligarch and his cronies instead of the will of the voters? Seriously? When 5 Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court in 2010 in the Citizens United decision ruled that when billionaires and big corporations bribe politicians, that's no longer called a bribe. That's now called free speech and protected by the First Amendment. When that happened to Republican voters, what did you expect? Did you believe it was going to work out well for democracy in America? Has it ever in any country? I mean, when Republican lobbyist Grover Norquist went on NPR and echoed the line that Reagan, both Bushes, and even Trump have said that, the big government's a dangerous thing. We need to shrink it down to where it's small enough that we could drown it in the bathtub. When he said that, Republican voters, what did you expect? Did you really think that gutting environmental and banking protections was going to help us? That letting corporations dump more pollution into our air and water and poison our children was going to make America better? Did you really think that restricting access to Medicaid and unemployment benefits and disability assistance was going to improve this country? Seriously? Republican voters, when Donald Trump and Reagan and both Bushes told you that if we just showered billionaires with tax cuts and subsidies for our biggest corporations, like the $600 billion a year we give to the oil industry, that all that money is going to trickle down and help you out. Right? Did you really think those billionaires were going to happily just pass their tax cuts along to you as a pay raise, Republican voters? Seriously? I mean, when Republican governors across the country told you, and not just Republican governors, the think tanks too, that only for-profit electric companies can provide you with safe, reliable power. Those nonprofits that are owned by state and county and municipal governments, oh, those are terrible, right? That's government. They don't have the profit motive. When they told you that, what did you expect?
I mean, did you really think that Enron ripping people off or PG&E setting, a chunk of California on fire was just some weird anomaly? Or that when the Texas power grid melted down because of a winter storm, just like they had just 10 years ago, that was just like a fluke? Seriously? Republican voters, when Ronald Reagan and every Republican since him told you that destroying labor unions was a good thing and would help American workers, really, seriously, what did you expect? Did you really think that no longer having organized workers, solidarity, representation against organized capital would somehow lift up American workers and cause CEOs to cut their own or keep their own pay reasonable? Seriously? Republican voters, when George H.W. Bush told you that the nation needs to double down on Nixon's war on drugs and put more people in prison, particularly those black people who are selling crack cocaine across the street from the White House. Remember when George Bush Sr. set that thing up? He set up a sale so that he could wave it a bag of cocaine on TV. If you're old enough, you remember it well. It was a big deal. He held a national television, press conference about it. Did you really think, Republican voters, that putting millions of black people in prison for decades, like Bush did, like he pitched with his Willie Horton ad, that was somehow going to make America a better place to live? Really? Are you that racist? Republican voters, when Donald Trump tried to cut off food stamps to 1 million people in the middle of a pandemic, a policy that Joe Biden literally just reversed, I believe it was yesterday. When Donald Trump said that he was going to cut off those food stamps to force people back to work in the middle of a pandemic when there's 20 million missing jobs, what did you expect? When former oil industry CEOs, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, told you that Iraq's Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, just coincidentally was sitting on the second largest oil reserve in the world, was plotting to kill America. When our own weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, and the UN weapons inspector, Hans Blick, were going on international television saying, this guy has no weapons. He doesn't represent a threat to anybody. But Bush and Cheney were pushing this really hard. Did you really expect that something good was going to come out of that? Seriously, Republican voters, did you think that America could conquer a country, sell off its natural resources, and the people in that country would just be like, oh, this is nice. We're happy with this. Thank you very much. I mean, how'd that work out in Vietnam? When Wall Street billionaire Pete Peterson and his buddies in the GOP put up the debt clock and started saying, well, Social Security is just a Ponzi scheme. It's going to go broke. We need to turn it over to Wall Street bankers like Pete Peterson. What did you expect? Did you think that those bankers and the Republicans they own were actually going to help build a stronger social safety net for America? When Reagan's Interior Secretary, James Watt, Republican voters, told you it's just fine to sell off federal lands for pennies on the dollar because Jesus is coming back and he's going to make all things new. What did you expect? For that matter, when Trump's Interior Secretary, a coal lobbyist for God's sake, said the same thing without invoking Jesus. Did you really expect it was going to help our public lands? Did you think it had nothing at all to do with these massive campaign contributions from the, to the GOP? Seriously, Republican voters. I mean, I have a few more to share with you. I will do so after the break. And a point to make at the very end of this. But what's up with Republican voters? For 40 years, they have been buying these lies. Is it just race? Is racism enough to animate an entire political party? We'll be back. It's 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Or do Republicans really believe that if everything is done for the billionaires, somehow that's going to help, Joe Republican? Seriously? As Joyce is stacking up some calls here, I'll just, point out that I can't get it. I mean, I used to debate this stuff with my dad, but he was an Eisenhower Republican. He thought that Social Security was a good thing. He thought that unions were a good thing. He thought that the high tax rate was a good thing. In fact, he advised me. He taught Louise double entry bookkeeping, and when we had this little business back in the early '70s, and he was like, There's good stuff that government can do. I just don't get it. It's amazing. I just don't get it. Diana in Preston, Idaho. Diana, you want to go back to you were talking yesterday about the Second Amendment, or I guess that was the first thing in my rant today, wasn't it? What's up, Diana?
Yes, it was. So, hi, Tom. I think it was Monday's show. You had an intelligent-sounding male caller who called in about guns and the Second Amendment. He made the comment that if Jews had guns, they would have been able to defend themselves and not been led like sheep to the slaughter. It concerned me, and it upset me a little, too, that lie is still being spread. And I'd like to suggest that I would like to suggest that he delve a little deeper into the subject, if he can stand it, and he'll find that the self-pity and the kind of literature that came out in the beginning seemed filled with a victim-like attitude. But eventually, during the 80s and the early 90s, the atmosphere started shifting toward a recognition of the courage and the nobility of the people that miraculously survived. And I think
look at the Warsaw Uprising. I mean, it ultimately got put down, but and people were using guns in the Warsaw Uprising as well.
Yeah, and I think that anyone who delves deeper into the subject will realize that they were not at all like lambs to the slaughter. And my opinion is that Jews with guns could not have stopped Hitler. Only concerned people from outside could have and eventually did stop Hitler. Inside, they had quite a few chances to stop him, and they chose not to. In the old question that nagged historians and politicians and the people of the world about Germany, a highly developed and intelligent nation, at that time, Tom, they had more books than any other nation on the planet. How is it possible that it turned into a nation of criminals? How is it possible that the USA for the last 5 years has been evolving into a nation of criminals? And the two nations have much in common, but I think the overwhelming influence is the leaders, Hitler and Trump. And I think it was you who said on one of your shows, words are powerful, leaders matter. Incompetence mixed with arrogance and the goons and the thugs and the racists that follow them. And American companies, remember, American companies basically funded the Nazis. And money has an insidious way of making decent human beings behave in most insidious ways. And
that's why Fritz Tyson wrote, an autobiography, I Paid Hitler, basically apologizing for it. When a country is sliding into fascism, the only way you can stop that, you can't stop that with guns. You can't rise up against the government. They'll just squash you, which is what Hitler did. Right. The only way you can stop that within the country is internal politics, which Germany failed to do, and we just succeeded in doing by dumping Trump. But once that transition is complete and the country is a fascist country, it takes an external force to stop them. We'll be back. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Want to know more? The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. To continue my rant, this is my open letter to Republican voters that I published this morning over at hartmannreport.com, which is free. You can get it in your email box every day for free, there it is. Anyhow, dear Republican voter, right? When Republicans changed course in 1980 and threw in with the anti-abortion activists, but promised that there would only be reasonable restrictions on abortion if you just went along with them, what'd you expect? How about Arkansas last week passing a law that will put a child who's impregnated by a rapist in prison if she tries to get an abortion? Or Texas, which is trying right now to give the death penalty to people who are impregnated as a result of rape or incest in Texas to young women. I mean, is that what you expected? When Donald Trump, a dear Republican voter, encouraged violence at his rallies, when he promoted racist slogans and policies, when he promised to pay the legal bills of people who became violent at his rallies, when he openly celebrated police, quote, roughing up the people they're supposed to protect and serve, what did you expect, Republican voters? Did you really think that was going to restrain the authoritarianism and racism of his followers and police? Really? When Trump and Fox News tried to characterize as thugs the literally millions of people in American streets protesting the murder of George Floyd and so many other unarmed black people, particularly black men, what did you expect? Did you think that the cops would stop racist and violent policing without any sort of public pressure? Without any accountability? When did that ever happen? When oil company shills, Republican voters, were all over the media telling us that global warming was a hoax. Carbon dioxide's good for trees, don't you know? We need more of it. And for 40 years, Republican politicians echoed those lies, and they still are, almost to a person. What did you expect? Did you really believe that burning all those fossil fuels and throwing all those poisons in the air would have no consequence? When during the last 3 presidential primaries, Republican candidates like Ron Paul argued that the best way to provide health care to Americans is to do away with all federal government health care programs. That'll cause people to stand on their own 2 feet, as Ron Paul said. What did you expect when the party said that was their position? Did you really buy Congressman Paul's argument that back when he was a doctor, back in the day, he used to take payment in chickens, and we should use that as the inspiration for America's national health care system today? I mean, seriously, Republican voters, when you voted for Republicans while Education Secretary Betsy DeVos was actively gutting our public schools, promoting for-profit corporate schools, and making a joke out of any kind of student debt relief, what did you expect? Did you actually believe the GOP had any interest whatsoever in building up our public schools and helping our teachers? I mean, when your Republican state legislators told you that they were passing legislation to ensure election integrity, what did you expect? Did you really believe they were going to make sure everybody in America who's legally eligible to vote is going to have their vote counted? Did you assume they'd never end up blocking you, maybe by accident, from the voting rolls? Seriously, did you expect Republicans who are somehow did you think that they were somehow going to do away with the 10-hour lines in neighborhoods that have really high proportions of registered Democrats? But everything is going to be fine for you? Did you believe them when they said voting by mail was dangerous and insecure? When we've been doing that in Oregon here for 20 years, Washington State, Idaho, Utah, Hawaii, and pretty much all of Western Europe for decades, for a generation, without any problems at all? And you believed them that we should be worried about voting by mail? Really? You know, the simple fact, and I'm sure I'm missing some things here. Feel free to call in and tell me what I missed, and I can always edit my article, in fact, and add them. The simple fact is that Republicans have been lying to voters like you, Republican voter. They have been lying to you for 40 years. From Nixon's Southern strategy and his war on drugs, through Reagan's supply-side economics, to Donald Trump's voter fraud. These are lies. And they're all lies to disguise the fact that the GOP has, ever since the Reagan Revolution, been 100% the party of billionaires and big corporations, period, full stop. Those of you who have listened to this program for more than a few years, you know I only talk about it a couple times a year. I should probably talk about it more. But for the 18 years I have been doing this show, I have had a contest running. And it's very simple. If you can name any piece of legislation passed, post-1980, after the Reagan Revolution, if you can name a single piece of legislation that was originally written by a Republican, that was sponsored by a majority of Republicans in Congress, that was passed with majority Republican votes in the House and Senate and that was signed into law by a Republican president. One piece of legislation whose principal beneficiary is the average American instead of a billionaire or a corporation. I will give you an autographed copy of any one of my books you want, and I will inscribe it however you'd like. 18 years I've been running that contest. No one has won yet. You know, the last election, the 2020 election, when the Republicans lost the White House, the House, and the Senate, what that says to me is that Americans, including Republican voters, are waking up to the fact that the Republican voters have been the victims of a long con run by a group of right-wing billionaires and big corporations that started in the 1970s and that seized control of our government in 1981. And Republican voters are starting to figure this out. They're starting to wake the hell up. And it's about time. And I'm telling you, if you're a Republican voter, if you bought any of these big lies in the past, the Democratic Party is here to help. Seriously. And if you have a progressive bone in your body, you need to get inside the Democratic Party so that they can help even better and more aggressively and more actively. Because all this whole list of stuff that I just went through, this is what's at stake now. We have to reverse Reaganism if America is to survive. Otherwise, it's off to Trumpism, and that's the end of democracy.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So what say you, especially Republican voters? Give me a shout. I'll pick up your calls after the break.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status. Fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive-sum, but identity conflict is zero-sum. The book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein.
This week on The Science Revolution is Dr. Justin Frank, author of the Trump, Obama, and Bush on the Couch series of books. He's here on how to deal with the trauma of the pandemic and the trauma of 4 years of Trump. It's been a stressful time. Some of us have lost family and friends and have found it difficult to stay safe and pay the bills. The Trump years have been a challenge to democracy and our sanity. Dr. Justin Frank is here to help. Tune into The Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. So, what do you think, Kim? Have I missed some things in my list, or have I gone over the top? Have I mischaracterized in any way, in anything on my list, Republican policies over the last 40 years? Now, I always say in the last 40 years because even Nixon signed. I realize he actually did veto the Clean Water Act. They overrode his veto. He threatened to veto the EPA, but he signed them. And he actually enforced them. And Dwight Eisenhower, these are the two Republican presidents that well, along with Jerry Ford, who just kind of, stumbled through a year or so and got us out of the Vietnam War. But, the two Republican presidents of any consequence, who both had 8-year terms, Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, they were not, Nixon was corrupt and Eisenhower was just kind of, okay, let's maintain the status quo. But Eisenhower actually did a lot. He rebuilt America after World War II in big ways. education, the response to Sputnik in 1957, the space program, creating NASA. I mean, all this stuff. Republicans used to actually believe in America and want America to be stronger and better and support the American people. Even Richard Nixon did not declare war on labor unions. He didn't like them, but he didn't declare war on them like Reagan did. So am I missing something? Am I overstating anything? Dale in Springfield, Missouri. Hey, Dale, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Tom, you didn't miss a thing. My 75-year-old brother and my 2 aunts and uncles in Colorado absolutely believe everything you said in your rant. All the while, they're bragging about how well Medicare and Social Security take care of them in their old age. They all believe the government is bad, but love its benefits. They believe that we need a businessman to run our country and that all immigrants are bad, even though our own grandparents were immigrants. They were white immigrants, of course. They also will tell you that cheating to win an election is okay if that's what it takes for their people to win. You didn't miss a thing that I heard of, but the fact that we have 75 million people that believe that is awful scary.
Dale, you have relatives who, as you said, who absolutely believe all those things. What do you think it's going to take to wake them up?
You can't wake them up. I have been arguing with my brother since the election, and you can't wake him up. He still believes that Hillary ran a pedophile ring in a pizza parlor.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah. They absolutely believe this crap. And that Joe Biden's policies are the beginning of socialism in our country.
Yeah. Okay. Dale, thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspective and your story with us. I appreciate it. And thanks for listening to us on SiriusXM. Caleb over in Westboro, Pennsylvania, watching us on Facebook Live. Hey, Caleb, what's on your mind today?
So, Tom, I wanted to recommend that you consider having Nancy McLean as a guest on your program.
She's been on the program a couple of times. You can find my conversations with her over on our YouTube channel. She wrote a brilliant book, Democracy in Chains. Democracy in Chains.
I wanted just to, having read that book, it backs up everything that you said in your rant this morning, just the way Dale said, and her discovery of the thought model that James Buchanan came up with at the University of Virginia, that has been adopted by the Republicans, is playing out in real time in front of our eyes. And so I'm glad that you have spoken to her, and I hope you speak to her again, because I think that this business of enchaining democracy is happening in front of our eyes right now with these voter suppression laws that are happening at the state level all over the country right now, and that is a manifestation of the whole idea of enchaining democracy in order to save it from the rabble. So. Right, and the rabble being the people who want, free public education and health care for all, and just the basic stuff that every European takes for granted. Caleb, thank you for that. And if to everybody listening, if you have not read Nancy McLean's book Democracy in Chains, it's really worth the read. That and the companion piece, I would say, is Jane Mayer's book Dark Money. They both came out 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that, but they're both brilliant. Ivan in El Paso, Texas. You're on the air, Ivan.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm a first-time listener. First-time caller. I'm sorry. I've been listening to your show quite a while. And thank you. No problem. I completely agree with what you're saying, because all these Republicans in office are not letting this country to progress, to go forward. One of the reasons why most people believe in Republicans is that they're having a right-of-way access on their fingertips to right-wing media, if I can allow to say a little bit on this, because the right-wing media was playing a big role on that kind of citizens in the American people. Is that they believe on what they're saying and their mind and their lives, and that's why Democrats are struggling to get in power. I mean, in office.
Yeah.
That's why Republicans.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and I've written about this and talked about this for a long time. There is a huge right-wing media infrastructure. Fox News is just the tip of the iceberg, and they have been indoctrinating Americans for decades. And it's not just national, by the way. Every town of any consequence has their own local right-wing media hosts who are spilling this over into state policy, into city policy, making it tough for mayors to do anything, making it tough for state legislators to do it. You just see it all over the country, and we're certainly seeing it here. Ivan, thank you for the call. George in Portland, Oregon. Hey, George, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Great rant. I think the importance of it is that, I'm sorry, it is so important that we need someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris to get on, prime time and read it, verbatim. I mean, your audience is not reaching enough of these voters to really let any of this stuff sink in. As large as your audience is, we're all pretty like-minded, So
No.
how do you get it out there?
I get it, George. I think that what's happening is that people are getting this. I think they are figuring it out. And Biden is taking a fairly soft approach to the Republicans, constantly reaching out to them, knowing that they're just going to slap his hand away. But he keeps doing it so that nobody can say, oh, he's just trying to ram it through, which is the favorite phrase that FreedomWorks is always using in their emails to me, ram it through, like, some sort of violent or sexual or something like that. It's just terrible. It's the way that they're characterizing this stuff. But yeah, I'm with you, George. Thank you. April in Santa Monica. Hey, April, what's up?
Hi, Tom. It's good to talk to you again. I just want us to caution ourselves at pointing at the white supremacists that are running around rampant in the country right now. I don't understand why we're surprised about this, because we really need to wrap our minds around the fact that this country was founded by white supremacists. The people that were constantly putting up and saying we want to go back to what the founders – this is what the founders – the white supremacy is what the founders did. Everything in the Constitution that we have right now that is for all of us, that's for the good, were amendments that we had to fight and fight and fight to get. So when they say we want to take our country back, they're referring – these are the founders. These are the people of the founders. So we really need to get at the root of the problem if we want this country to be better. And that means that we can't keep putting the founders up as if they're these men, as if they were something that we are not, because they were. That is who we are. That's how we got here.
Yeah, and that's that so-called originalism. And when Trump says "Make America Great Again," he's at the very least he's talking about pre-1954 Brown v. Board. Let's go back to segregation.
Absolutely.
And his followers will just say that right out loud.
Absolutely. And so, and also, again, though, until we go back way before that and say to ourselves that the founders founded this country on the myth of white supremacy, and then go from there. Yes. We need to go from there.
And you can even go back before the founders. You can go back to the doctrine of discovery that Columbus used to seize Hispaniola, what we now call Haiti and Dominican Republic, and ultimately Puerto Rico.
And that brings
this has deep roots.
Yeah, and that brings me to my other thing that I get really angered about and frustrated about is the fact that we can even ever have said that Christopher Columbus discovered America when he never even got here. He's never set foot on the North American continent.
Plus, the country was already occupied.
Yeah, well, he never even got here to see the occupation.
You're right. But how do you discover a country? I mean, Hispaniola was already occupied, too. Yeah. There were hundreds of thousands of Taino Indians there. How do you discover a country that's already occupied? It just blows my mind. April, thank you. So well said.
And not step foot on that soil.
Listening to Thom Hartmann.
Amen.
Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's a great, what a great point April made. And I think that white supremacy underlies so much of this stuff. People are willing to trade away that for anything else. And welcome back. Let's see here. Sandora in Seattle. Hey, Sandora, what's up?
Hey there. I have a really clear response to the assault rifles and what's been going on with our massacres. I think we as a country, it's like a teenager, you know, when you give them responsibilities, what they can handle and what they can't. Well, we as a country obviously can't handle our gun rights. We've proven it over and over again. And when you look at other countries, as the world as a whole, how they've handled it, you know, it's just like a criminal. When they keep breaking the law, there's a prison for it. There's a consequence. And I just think as a whole, we as a country cannot handle our gun rights with the assault, as far as the assault rifles go. So that's all I had.
And I don't think that you can find any country in the history of the world that has basically just said any old crazy person who wants to buy, you know, 30 weapons that are capable of firing 100 rounds of high velocity ammunition can do so, has had a positive outcome as a consequence of that. I mean, you know, you look at countries where guns are widely available, like Afghanistan and Iraq, and how's that working out, right? It's just, spot on.
I want to simplify it.
Yeah, there you go. Sandora, well said.
We obviously can't handle it. Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you very much, and thanks for listening to KBCS. Joe, watching Free Speech TV in Elk Grove, California. Hey, Joe, what's up?
Hi, how you doing, Tom? I've been a long-time listener and watcher. I had two things I wanted to bring up. One, there was a book called "And the Fed" by Ron Paul, and I guess he's an independent. He's not really a Democrat or a Republican.
Ron Paul's a Republican.
Well, okay.
He calls himself a libertarian as well, but he's still a registered Republican, as is his son, who is now a Republican senator from Kentucky.
But it would seem he's trying to distance himself from the party.
Oh, okay.
But anyway,
I haven't followed him in the last few years, so that may be the case. But what's your point about ending the Fed?
Discussion of the Federal Reserve, obviously how it began under Rockefeller in 1913, and what has become of the Fed today, which is basically the money spigot of the country, and the Federal Reserve note that people are using to spend are clearly. I don't know that they noticed the separation of the Federal Reserve from the state itself, and the fact that he's been calling for the Government Accounting Office to do an audit of the Federal Reserve, and since I guess pretty early on in his career.
Him and Bernie actually have been calling for that for years, as well as an audit of the Pentagon. But you want to go back to the gold standard? I mean, the United States would have to go out and buy trillions of dollars worth of gold to keep our currency from just, exploding.
I know, but it looks to me like the financial powers of the planet are in search of some kind of currency that maintains value. Bitcoin is a pretty evident phenomena right now.
But that's not going to make it, because all you have to do is have one supercomputer, and suddenly you can mint all the Bitcoin in the world. I mean, the Bitcoin thing is going to really fall victim to computing power eventually. Joe, I just don't see an alternative to Federal Reserve and this is why it's being done all over the world. I would love to see an alternative, but actually what I've been saying is I think the Fed should be basically taken over by the Treasury Department. The problem with that is you're putting the Fed under political control. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So people wonder, why militias all of a sudden? How is it that all kinds of Americans are showing up with assault weapons in the Capitol building trying to assassinate the Vice President of the United States and the Speaker of the House of Representatives and stop the counting of the presidential votes, the Electoral College votes? Where did this come from? The last time we saw an armed uprising against the federal government in the United States was 1861. It was the Confederacy. Is this a Confederacy rising again? Well, yeah, there is a huge white supremacist element to it. In fact, I'd say it's one of the primary animating impulses. But what really got these things going, these militias going, was the Heller decision written by the opinion written by Antonin Scalia and published on June 26, 2008. And it has crazy language in it, basically begging for militias. I share it with you in a special video over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. "51 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Terry in Woodstock, Illinois. Hey, Terry, what's up?
30 years in the IBW, and Tom, I'm blown away by my union brothers who are Trump fanatics and actually some of them QAnon. What is going on in our country?
I think that, number one, Zuckerberg and Facebook have created this kind of a monster in some ways that allows the spread of viral disinformation. And it's not obviously unique to Facebook, but that's where much of this stuff, I think probably most of this stuff is going on. Number two, you've got multiple foreign actors. It's not just Russian trolls showing up and promoting this kind of disinformation. Now we find that there are Saudi trolls doing this. There's Iranian trolls doing this. You've got a bunch of countries that really don't like the United States, who are as state sponsors, essentially, of disinformation. And it's not so much that they don't like the United States, they don't like the idea of democracy itself, right? And that's why the idea of democracy is under assault. It's just amazing to me. I see these bots running on Twitter, for example. I'll post something about democracy, and I'll get a reply like, "Oh, the Democrats are just like the Republicans," which was the main message that was conveyed to people in 2016 by the Russian trolls, and actually suppressed the vote. Essentially, a lot of Democrats just said, "Okay, screw it, I won't vote." But then you look at their account, and what they've done is they've retweeted like 40 other people, very little original content, because they're just running as bots, trying to accumulate followers. I mean, it's crazy stuff, Terry. But have you been able to get through to any of your coworkers?
I chip away, and every time I present them with a fact that can't be denied, they'll agree even, and yet that doesn't change their support so far. I haven't given up, but I think it's, in my opinion, it's a failure of our educational system, for one, in that these people cannot delineate facts from the garbage.
When Reagan put Bill Bennett in charge of the education department, Bill Bennett, who famously said, if you wanted to reduce crime in America, just abort every black baby. He literally said that. You can hear it on, in fact, he went on television to defend it. He went on the news to defend that statement. When Reagan put Bill Bennett in charge of the education department, and Bill Bennett basically gutted civics education, we have had now 2 generations of young people, throughout the 80s and 90s and the first 2 decades of this century, who have not been exposed to civics education in probably a majority of our schools, certainly not in the South and in the Republican-controlled states. And it's an absolute screaming tragedy. And American history has been taught in ways that actually don't even reflect our true history. So, Terry, I'm with you. I'm with you. And I wish you the very best in waking up your compatriots. Martha in Detroit. Hey, Martha, what's on your mind?
Hi, I just wanted to say that we really have to fight for reproductive rights and for women, and this is one of the key things, how they get women, especially older suburban white women, to vote for the Republicans, because with their ads against abortion and things like that, and health care for women. I think that older women a lot of times forget what it's like to be young and worried you're pregnant all the time and go through all the different, because I'm 62, right? When I was younger, it was a big concern for me. And as I got older, I get a little bit more, like conservative in my views. So they forget about it. Young women need that reproductive health care and their rights. And so maybe we can break through that way, because I see a lot of young women now, they're like, they want to have a family. Most women, they want to have babies, things like that. So the idea of a baby being, ripped from a woman's womb, it really upsets them.
Yeah. I get it, Martha, and I get that there is opposition to abortion by people who actually are reasonable. In fact, there's a Democratic group, you know, an anti-abortion Democratic group, you know, but that's you know, a real part of the Democratic Party. They're not making crazy assertions like the Arkansas law that says that if a 13-year-old gets impregnated by a rapist, she goes to prison if she tries to get an abortion. And, you know, I mean, what we're looking at here, I think, is misogyny writ large. Kevin in Seattle. Hey, Kevin, what's up? You have the last minute here in the hour. What's up?
Hey, Tom, loved your analysis, rants of the long con these Republican con men have been running for so long. They pretty much invoke religion, and their conservative supporters just eat it up. They love that lie, and it's really sad but amazing to see it. But I liked your take on it.
Oh, that's what I have to add to my article, is when Republicans told you they were the party of Jesus and they never bothered to read Matthew 25. You know, it's like... so I'm going to, during the break, I'll go over to HartmannReport.com and edit that in, because that's a great point, Kevin. And now you've got, you know, right-wing religious leaders who are preaching politics from the pulpit in defiance of the Internal Revenue Service.
Well, they preach the Old Testament mostly, but the IRS stuff seems to come from Jesus flipping the tables, and that's the highlight of it. But they haven't really read the Bible, so...
Yeah, no, my point was, and thank you, Kevin, for the call. My point was they enjoy tax-exempt status. They're subsidized by you and by me. We pay for their police service. We pay for their fire protection. We pay for the public roads that bring their parishioners. And yet, they are preaching politics, which the Internal Revenue Code says you can't do if you're being partisan. We'll be back with Richard Wolff.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Gabi.com. Gabi takes the pain out of shopping for insurance. More info at Gabi.com/Tom. Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Help. More info at teethhealth.com, code Tom. Hello Fresh, delivering fresh ingredients and mouthwatering recipes. More info at hellofresh.com, code Tom. Bowl and Branch, crafted for the common good. More information at bowlandbranch.com, code Tom. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More info at expressvpn.com/Tom. And CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code Tom.
For our Thom Hartmann Book Club excerpt today, we're reading from Ed Morales' new book, Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. This is from the first chapter. There was never any doubt that the United States wanted Puerto Rico for its own when it began a war with Spain near the turn of the 20th century. Cuba had been in the throes of independence war with Spain off and on since 1868, and the conflict that began in 1895 seemed ripe for the United States to capitalize on. The sinking of the USS Maine, an American naval ship destroyed by an explosion while moored just outside Havana, fueled American entry into the war. Although there are conflicting theories about the source of the explosion, including the likelihood it was caused by a spontaneous internal fire, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper chain blew up the incident into the perfect catalyst for the United States to enter the conflict. When Theodore Roosevelt entered the fray with his army of Rough Riders, the whole affair came as no surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention to the lust U.S. government leaders and military had long expressed to expand southward and westward. And although the idea of manifest destiny was at the forefront of the political discourse of this period, it's less often observed that the United States' expansionist gaze was saturated with racial language and attitudes, at once desirous of and repelled by Latin America's mestizo mulatto social dynamic. The Haitian Revolution at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th created a U.S. obsession with both Cuba and Puerto Rico because of the potential of a similar black-led revolt on those islands. In 1826, Virginia Senator John Randolph feared that such a revolt would render the southern United States vulnerable to invasion from Cubans in rowboats. For this reason, he objected to the United States participating in the 1826 Panama Congress because American diplomats would have to endure the horror of a U.S. diplomat taking his seat in the Congress, quote, beside the native African, their American descendants, the mixed breeds, the Indians, and the half-breeds, without any offense or scandal at so motley a mixture, end quote. The logic driving this perspective underlined not only the importance of slavery to the emergence of capitalism in the 19th century, but also, as Matthew Karp points out in this vast southern empire, the extent to which slave owners and their elected representatives disproportionately shaped U.S. foreign policy. Going back as far as the Haitian Revolution, fear of a successful slave rebellion in the newly formed United States strongly motivated Southern politicians. As Karp mentions, to that end, Presidents Madison and Monroe, quote, used overwhelming force to destroy black maroon settlements in southern Florida, end quote. Fear of slave rebellions also briefly united the interests of American slaveholders and Cuban elites who wanted independence from Spain, but in the late 19th century, after abolition, Roosevelt's forces fought in conjunction with Afro-Cuban armies against their common Spanish foe. The move to wrest Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain came just as Spain had finally relented to end slavery as a concession to black rebel Cuban armies that had formed to push for independence. In a further move to placate continued unrest on the island, in November 1897, Spain signed automatic charters for Cuba and Puerto Rico, which gave limited home rule governments to both islands. Puerto Rico would gain full representation in the Cortes, the Spanish parliament, and could veto Spanish commercial treaties unfavorable to them while also retaining the rights to set tariffs on imports and exports. In this way, Puerto Ricans were granted a kind of citizenship that allowed self-government grafted on what was left of their Spanish subjecthood. Yet on July 25, 1898, 8 days after the first meeting of the newly formed Puerto Rican Parliament, U.S. troops arrived in the southern port of Guanica and replaced the Spanish flag with the stars and stripes. This date would be remembered over 50 years later when the United States finally followed through on a project to allow Puerto Ricans to have limited autonomy and self-government. But at the time, it was both the end of Teddy Roosevelt's splendid little war and the beginning of the current quandary over what exactly Puerto Rico's new colonial master would do with the island. Although historians agree that there was no pre-existing plan for designating Puerto Rico's status, there was a general belief that Puerto Rico could be incorporated as a U.S. territory and probably would be. This led many to assume that it would follow a similar path to statehood as former territories like Florida and Louisiana. At the very least, it would, by acceding to military control, receive, quote, the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization, end quote, as Puerto Rico's first military governor, Nelson A. Miles, declared 3 days after the landing of Guanica. Because Cuba was so militarized during its wars for independence, the United States decided to allow it national sovereignty, thinking it could still exert considerable control over the economy because of existing business interests and a ready-made set of Cuban consumers who were already buying Ford Model Ts. But although Puerto Rico had experienced anti-Spanish uprisings in the mid-19th century, in 1898 they did not have nearly the same level of armed mobilization present. So the United States held on to it, particularly because of its geographic location, which would provide the United States with a stronghold on the easternmost tip of the Caribbean. The book is Fantasy Island by Ed Morales.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, world-famous economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also now available as an ebook. democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com, and you can tweet him at Prof Wolff, Profwolff. And Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. It seems to me that in a capitalist society, when something that is intuitively wrong keeps happening over and over and over, and particularly in bigger and bigger ways over time, that there's money behind it, that there's economics behind it. And I'm wondering your thoughts on the economics of mass shootings and police shootings. And I realize those may be two separate things, but you know, your systemic analysis of capitalism and of our society, I would love to hear your take on those topics.
Okay, I think about it a lot, like I'm sure most Americans do, watching these horrific headlines over the years, and as you say, getting worse. Here is the way I look at it through a lens of economics. We have a very large industry in this country that produces guns, ammunition, all the paraphernalia that go with having weapons. I'm not here talking about people who have weapons because they like to go hunting. That's a very old tradition in this country, and that was not, for much of our history, associated with anything like the mass shootings that we have witnessed in recent years. So here's my take. That industry saw an opportunity to grow beyond the people who are either into marksman-type activity or into hunting, to open up a great new field for profitable sale of guns, ammunition, and so on. And they approached advertisers, as capitalists always do, to help them grow, build their market. And what advertisers always do is try to link the product that's paying their bills to something that human beings need. Let me give you a simple example. You produce soap. It's a very pedestrian sort of thing. But if you can do a lot of advertising suggesting that the use of your particular brand of soap will do wonders for the sex life of anybody who takes showers with that soap, you may be able, and history shows us you will be able, to generate a great new demand for your soap by people who are concerned about their sex life. In this case, the guns and ammunitions people, together with the advertising industry, two profitable industries, came up with a doozy. They would fund something called the National Rifle Association and other kinds of public events, institutions, and so on, and they would link the ownership, the purchase and ownership of a gun to being somehow safe, to being somehow secure, to being somehow immune to the dangers and troubles that everyone was feeling in the United States as our economic dominance was undermined, as the welfare and standard of living of our working class was undermined. When you felt everything was falling apart, you could feel a little safer if you just bought one or maybe 5 weapons and put them on the back of your pickup truck or in a case in your house that other folks could see, and then you could shoot it occasionally to convince yourself that you were good at this, or wear it on your belt to show how safe you were 24/7. It was a genius advertising ploy, and it made millions of Americans who don't hunt and who don't care about being sharpshooters, it made them buy, store, maintain, repair, oil, and in other words, manage a storehouse, spending money they probably could not afford and certainly would have had better uses for than simply having these weapons. And then, of course, we have to put that together with the fact that we live in a country the United States, which has more military bases around the world than any other country, which is normally engaged in multiple wars. To date, for example, in Afghanistan, we're still there. In Iraq, we're still there. In Libya and Yemen, directly or indirectly, we are involved. In Syria, we are involved. Within a few weeks of the new presidency of Joseph Biden, he had dumped a drone attack in Syria, killing people. The idea that these weapons are ways of solving problems, that's the contribution of our governmental apparatus. But the real economic core is a very smart, profit-making advertising strategy that the arms producers, the so-called sports arm producers, came up with decades ago. And the National Rifle Association is basically the public face of this kind of promotion, that you will be better off, more secure. And of course, this has to drown out the hard reality, which is that the United States has more gun-violent deaths than any other country on the world. And not only that, but we're off the chart. The numbers for the United States are, in some cases, hundreds of times larger than in places like Germany or England or a whole host of other countries.
I would add to your advertising shtick masculinity. I mean, the safety thing, I remember back in the 80s and 90s, that was a big sales pitch. And right. You can stop the guy who's going to carjack you, and you want your wife to be safe. Have a gun in her purse. I remember those advertising campaigns. But now it seems like they have hooked up with the whole militia movement, and now they're promoting this as, if you want to be a man, you got to carry a gun.
Absolutely. No, look, the American male, if you look at the statistics, has suffered even more in the stagnation of wages than women. Women have been fighting to get a bit of a better deal. They have narrowed at least the gap between male and female wages in the United States, but many of the jobs that were pushed overseas were unionized jobs in which males were predominant, for all the reasons, good and bad, that go into that. And so they've suffered disproportionately. And losing your job or losing your woman partner, if you have one, has been associated over and over again with these mass shootings. People who have been really hurt in their personal life or their job life then have this gun, have this illusion that it makes them somehow manly and or safe, and they're going to push against what they see as a threat, and they have this gun, and the end result is the headlines that we see in this country in a way the rest of the world simply does not.
Yeah, and in the last minute we have, it seems to me that the economics of police shootings have to do with capitalism essentially creating a permanent underclass, and when that underclass rises up, you meet that with violence, no?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a terrible story. You can see it with children in school. If the teacher, even inadvertently, gives kids the idea that somebody in the class, for whatever reason, girls versus boys, non-whites versus whites, people who live in that neighborhood rather than the other neighborhood, or have that name rather than the other name, if there's an allowable outlet for your upsets and your frustrations, that's where kids will go. They don't mean to pick somebody. They're doing what it is that the environment somehow suggests. And we put police, overwhelmingly white, in the position of trying to keep the lid on the African-American or Hispanic or Latino communities. It's an impossible task, and it blows up in these horrible, unfair ways.
Yeah, amen. Professor Richard Wolff, the website democracyatwork.info, his latest book, The Sickness is the System. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Professor Wolff, it's always great talking with you. Thank you for dropping by today.
Thank you, Tom.
Great having you with us. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's 15 minutes past the hour. Have you ever successfully reached a Republican colleague in any of the issues that we've been talking about here today? And welcome back. Jerry in Buena Vista, Colorado. Hey, Jerry, what's up? Thanks for watching Free Speech.
You bet. Just like to build a little bit on what Richard Wolff just mentioned. I believe he just made the case for why gun control should be considered an exercise in futility. And what we really need, earlier caller indicated the failure of education. I believe the failure of early elementary education. Too many students leave the third grade without the necessary skills, and they will struggle and ultimately become a problem as they move into the other grades. Baseline is school boards tend to worry about the budget rather than consider the value of education. And until we figure a way to fund education, we're always going to have kids out there who are going to struggle, ultimately become a threat to themselves as well as everybody else. Gun control isn't going to happen. Too many guns out there, too many people who find rationalization for keeping them. Richard Wolff made the case.
Jerry, are you familiar with the experience of Australia in 1996 after the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania?
Yes, I am. But Australia is Australia. It was that's an English country. I mean, that's like Canada.
Well, yes and no. I've worked in Australia. I've spent a lot of time in that country. I have some very, very good. In fact, one of my very closest friends is an Australian professor of neuroscience. And the cowboy culture in Australia puts the cowboy culture in America to shame. I mean, you know, toxic masculinity in Australia is kind of the national pastime, and yet. When they saw those pictures of all those dead people, I think it was like 35 dead people in the Port Arthur massacre, and this was after 2 decades of increasing numbers of mass shootings in Australia, they said, okay, enough is enough. We're over it. We're sick and tired of it. You know, Ganoog, no more. Dainu. And I think America could too. I mean, we talked about this yesterday at some length, but I think that if we can figure out a way to reasonably, appropriately, practically, with the help and participation of the mainstream media, share with Americans what kind of damage these weapons do. I mean, we heard the story out of Newtown, for example, that there were literally piles of dead children, and some of them, the bullets had ripped their faces apart or exploded their heads so badly that they had to do DNA tests to figure out which kid was which. You know, that evokes horrible mental images. But can you imagine what the picture would do? How that might change American behavior? That's what happened in Australia.
Well, but how do we do that? Who's going to do it?
I think, you know, what I called for yesterday is that somebody who is in a position to do so, and I would think that would come out of the White House, frankly, needs to convene a meeting of all the major media in the United States, or at least a dozen of them, you know, a couple of representatives of print, television, radio, radio probably not so much, and internet-based media, and get together and say, okay, we're going to release a couple of pictures. We're going to get the permission of the parents or the relatives. We're going to do it tastefully, as it were, you know, in quotes, and we're going to do it in a way that's not going to, or it's going to minimize triggering PTSD in people who are already the victims of violence. But we're going to release the damn pictures. That's what I think we have to do. Jerry, thank you. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Boy, the headline over at Daily Kos. Tucker Carlson goes full insurrectionist, promotes AR-15s to use against the government. Again, let's just clearly establish, you know, again, another one of these Republican talking points, because they've been bought and paid for by the gun industry. Make no mistake about it. This is a multi-billion-dollar, multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry that pays its shills very, very well. And prior to the 1970s, nobody in America, all the way back to the founding of our republic, nobody in America was ever trying to make the serious case that the reason the founders wrote the Second Amendment the way they did at the time they did was because they wanted Americans to have weapons that they could use against our own government. Nobody ever made that case. That case on its face is seditious. On its face is treason. Yes, let's take down the government with guns. That's called a coup. That's not called democracy. The founders not only never imagined that, if they ever, I'm sure that they did in some point, you know, I mean, George Washington put down an armed rebellion. As president, he put down an armed rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. You know, they did not, in their wildest dreams, think this would be a good thing. And it wasn't until the 1970s when the National Rifle Association's magazine, The Rifleman, published this article by this 17-year-old kid, this high school kid, who just kind of made up this fantasy that the Second Amendment was there so we could prevent tyranny. And back in the 70s, it was in the frame of, you know, if the communists ever really succeed in taking over America, we need our guns to fight back. Because there was this big fear about the communists. Richard Nixon and you know, had been going on about that. Keep in mind, this was just a couple of years after the end of the Nixon presidency, and Nixon had been going on for, you know, at some length about, you know, the communists in Vietnam and the communists in the Soviet Union, and you know, and he had been part of the whole McCarthy thing, you know, the communists in the State Department and the communists in the Army McCarthy hearings. And so it was, yeah, we got to have our guns to protect us from the damn communists. And every time a Democrat came along and said, well, maybe we should make education free, college for free. Oh, you're a communist. Well, how about health care? Shouldn't everybody have health care? Oh, you're a communist. And it worked for years. But the NRA published this article, and it struck a chord with the white nationalists, with the people who, I mean, keep in mind, this was the same time that Brown versus Board of Education was starting to be enforced in a real way. It happened, Brown v. Board was in 1954. There was a subsequent decision a year or two later, and forgive me, I can't recall the name of it. It's been a lot of years, but there was a subsequent decision that said that, yes, Brown should be put into place. I mean, basically the argument from the states was, we need more time if we're going to desegregate our schools or if we're going to integrate our schools. We need more time. And so the Supreme Court in the second decision following Brown said, you know, well, you know, with all due, whatever the word was, you know, yes, yes, but, right, essentially. And they gave them this, you know, there's no urgency kind of message. And so it took 2 decades for Brown to even, you know, I mean, you know, the whole busing thing, you know, it happened in the 70s. And the blowback to that was, oh my God, there's black people moving into my neighborhood, I need to have a gun. And that's when this thing really went full nuts, and white people didn't want to say, well, we have to have a gun because, you know, black people were rioting in Detroit, you know, in response to police violence. Therefore, they didn't want to say that. So, oh yeah, well, we got to fight back against the commies. And it became like an article of faith. So last night on Fox News, Tucker Carlson has this guest on. News Corp over on Daily Kos refers to him as an amosexual. Kalyan Noor, who once hosted a show on the NRA TV network, which is now out of business. So Carlson says, why, if somebody does something horrible in Boulder, does that mean you should strip from people the single most popular sporting rifle in America? That would be the AR-15. The one that commits relatively few crimes. More people are killed by a factor of 5 by knives than by rifles in this country. Why are they so intent on taking this one away? And his guest on Fox News, this is what your grandpa is hearing on Fox News. Honest to God. His guest says, and I quote, because honestly, if you really look at it, a lot of people like to undervalue what the Second Amendment was actually written for. It was designed to be a check against the government. See, here's this big lie. This is a complete lie. Anyhow, he goes on to say, a lot of people don't like to talk about that aspect. Of course, it was also there to allow us to defend ourselves. But if you think about it, the AR-15 symbolically and literally is the best defense against a tyrannical government. The best defense against a tyrannical government, as the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence said, is an educated and informed public. And what we have is a miseducated and misinformed, malinformed public, intentionally uninformed public, or an intentionally wrongly informed public. And I would add to that the best defense against a tyrannical government is for the people to become, more deeply interpenetrated with the government, for us to show up and get inside our political parties. If you're, my opening rant was to Republican voters, and I was saying, if you're a Republican voter of good conscience, you can join the Democratic Party. They'd welcome you. Well, let me add to that. If you're a Republican voter of good conscience, you might want to try and take over the Republican Party and turn them into something at least rational, because it is not a bad thing in a democracy for one political party that I like a lot to have a loyal opposition. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, but not
You're
crazy.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
When the loyal opposition becomes the crazy opposition, that's when everything falls apart. We'll be back with your calls after this. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Homewreckers by Aaron Glantz, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. The subtitle is How a Gang of Wall Street Kingpins, Hedge Fund Magnates, Crooked Banks, and Venture Capitalists suckered millions out of their homes and demolished the American dream. It's quite a subtitle. This is from chapter 21, titled Triumph of the Homewreckers. Donald Trump took the oath of office on a chilly Friday morning, delivering an inaugural address that promised an end to the corruption and impotence that had widened America's historic wealth gap. He understood that his victory had been propelled by harnessing the public's rage and envy at having been left behind in the economic recovery, and that he promised that he would not forget it. Evoking FDR's famous Forgotten Man speech from 1932 that promised to prioritize the needs of, quote, the man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, Trump declared, quote, the forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Politicians had prospered, he said, but jobs had evaporated, factories closed. Quote, the establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little chance to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. This all changes, starting right here and right now, Trump proclaimed, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. This is your day. This is your celebration. End of quote. The moment, however, belonged not to the great mass of struggling Americans, but to the new president's most ardent supporters, flamboyant businessmen who profited off the pain of the housing bust and were now poised to steer the ship of state for at least the next 4 years. As Trump reached out his hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, his close friend and inaugural committee chair, Tom Barack, stood behind him, smiling in a blue scarf and black overcoat. Afterward, Barack and Trump embraced at the U.S. Capitol's inaugural platform. The homewreckers had arrived. Barack didn't take an official position in the Trump administration, reportedly turning down an offer to be White House Chief of Staff, Treasury Secretary, or Ambassador to Mexico. Roger Stone told me he could have had any position he wanted, but working for the government would have meant making a lot less money. I don't think he has the belly for public service, Stone observed. Other homewreckers had no such qualms. If they changed the rules of the game now, they could make more money later. Steve Mnuchin, by now dubbed the foreclosure king by his critics, was confirmed as Treasury Secretary. His top deputy at One West, the bank, Joseph Otting, became the nation's chief bank regulator, the comptroller of the currency. Wilbur Ross, the bankruptcy tycoon who bought Florida's Bank United, became the Commerce Secretary, charged with everything from negotiating trade deals to overseeing the U.S. Census. Steve Schwarzman, the chairman of Blackstone, became chair of the White House's Strategic and Policy Forum, a group of business leaders who were to meet regularly with Trump. Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase was named vice chair. Though the group disbanded over the summer after Trump's statement that bigotry and violence on many sides were responsible for a white nationalist's killing a counter-protester in Charlottesville, Virginia, Schwarzman, along with Barack, is said to be among a small group of outsiders, including Sean Hannity, who are put directly through to the president rather than being routed through the normal communications channels. Hannity reportedly chats with Trump nightly. Schwarzman has flown on Air Force One. On February 12, 2017, less than a month into Trump's presidency, while the commander-in-chief was dining with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan at his Mar-a-Lago golf club, Schwarzman threw a massive 70th birthday bash at his Four Winds estate, barely a mile and a half away. This time, neither Donald nor Melania Trump could make it, but daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner did, along with Mnuchin, Ross, and a who's who of high finance and culture, from Henry Kravis, co-founder of the hostile takeover firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, to the fashion designer Donatella Versace. The party featured live camels, trapeze artists, fireworks, and a gondolier. Schwarzman's tennis courts were covered with Asian-themed staging. The man who'd hired Patti LaBelle to sing Happy Birthday for his 60th was serenaded by Gwen Stefani on his 70th. After Happy Birthday, the peroxide pop star took a, quote, a quick twirl with the birthday boy around a dance floor constructed inside a two-story tent where acrobats shimmied and jumped, the New York Times reported. Unlike a decade before, when Schwarzman's glorious pre-bust bash sparked condemnation from sources as conservative as the Wall Street Journal, this time the festivities sparked very little blowback. In her story, Bloomberg reporter Amanda Gordon reveled in the comparison with Schwarzman's 60th. There were some differences, though, she wrote. Remember that beautiful fur coat on Melania Trump? It was New York in February on a weeknight. This time, no bundling required, with many folks golfing and swimming all day before a balmy night and fireworks alongside a full moon. Howard Marks, the co-chairman of Oak Tree Capital, a vulture firm that had bought and flipped 3,000 foreclosures, told Gordon, quote, "The world is an uncertain place. A lot of people are unhappy with a lot of other people. There are a lot of things that people are upset about. So it's nice to have an evening where everybody's happy, harmonious, and upbeat." End quote. There was a lot of celebrating to be had. In June, the gang got together for the marriage of Steve Mnuchin and his third wife, actress Louise Linton, almost 2 decades younger than him. And then it continues from there. The book is Homewreckers by Aaron Glantz.
This week on The Science Revolution is Dr. Justin Frank, author of the Trump, Obama, and Bush on the Couch series of books. He's here on how to deal with the trauma of the pandemic and the trauma of 4 years of Trump. It's been a stressful time. Some of us have lost family and friends and have found it difficult to stay safe and pay the bills. The Trump years have been a challenge to democracy and our sanity. Dr. Justin Frank is here to help. Tune into The Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. There is so much in the news. It is nuts. But, you know, I think at the bottom line, though, underneath all of it, is the fate and future of small d democracy in these here United States of America. Are we going to be able to be a society where the majority of the people are well-informed, well-educated, feel safe and secure, and have access to just basic human rights stuff like healthcare and education, and can choose their representatives, you know, with neither force nor favor, right? In other words, that any person in the United States who qualifies to vote, in other words, who can legally entitled to vote, anybody who's a citizen, And in some states, I realize, felons and former felons can't vote. We can argue that. I don't think it should be the case. But any person who legally has the right to vote can vote. Is that going to be our country? Or are we going to turn into something completely different, which is what the GOP is trying to do right now in 43 states? It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It really and truly is. Anyhow, picking up some of your phone calls here. Patrick in East Lansing, Michigan. Hey, Patrick, what's up?
Hi, thank you for all your covering. I wanted to tell you what happened in Michigan in the last week, and it was on the front page of the New York Times yesterday. I got off a State Board of Education press conference about it. Michigan COVID cases are rising. We're the leading state in the nation after New Jersey, doubled in the past 2 weeks, tripled since March 1st. That was the date that the Republican legislature forced the schools to reopen unsafely and without giving the schools the December congressional federal stimulus money. They withheld $1.5 billion, but then of the $3.5 billion, they tie-barred it to stripping county public health directors of their emergency powers. And as a result, we don't have money for testing and vaccine distribution and the upgrades to ventilation. The largest group of infected people in these new case rates are aged 10 to 19, and the hospitalization rates for parents, like age 40 to 49, it's an 800% increase in hospitalization, 633% for 23 to 39. This all came from the press conference today by the State Board of Education. So I have a question, and that is, why isn't this getting more publicity? It's a completely unnecessary harm to force children to suffer from a health harm. The question is not whether to reopen, it's whether to reopen unsafely by leaving money unspent. The GOP leader, the Senate leader, is the problem. According to Ellen Kogan-Lipton on our state board, she was in the state house. She's a Harvard law grad, and she said GOP leader Shirky basically challenged Governor Whitmer, our Democratic governor, to a fistfight, but also is using this money by withholding it to weaponize children to get other things that deprive the governor of her powers because he disagrees with her use of those powers in a public health pandemic. The last thing I'll say is that our governor had put in place through executive order a water shutoff moratorium, which prevented the shutoff of water to over 100,000 homes and possibly as many as 200,000 people who couldn't afford to pay their water bills because they were unemployed. And in a pandemic, that's a public health necessity. Well, now the water shutoff moratorium is going to phase out March 31st because by one vote, the Supreme Court invalidated her emergency powers under a GOP lawsuit. And these same people who've had water shutoff moratorium in place have a rear-vision and face red tagging of their homes and homelessness, because when your water's shut off now, as cities will go and do, you lose your chance to live in your house when they put a red tag in, and then you have to move out, or it's a misdemeanor to stay there. So we're criminalizing people not being able to pay their water bill, and we're making the pandemic worse whether you're at home or whether you're at the school. It's a completely artificial crisis because the GOP is in the state Senate and in the House are blocking money that bipartisan our federal Congress has given us. So I wanted to raise the profile on that because I really am quite surprised that it hasn't gotten more national media attention.
That is mind-boggling. Patrick, I just made a note. I'm going to, after we get off the air, go trying to track down the information that you just laid out. Was it the Michigan Supreme Court that undid the water shutoff ban, or was it the U.S. Supreme Court?
So the Michigan Supreme Court made a ruling, and the ruling was by one vote to declare the governor's use of her emergency powers to exceed the scope of those powers. However, the governor had an alternate set of powers, and she put those in place under the 1918 Spanish flu set of laws that allows the Michigan Department of Health director to allow for the same exercise of power. So when she pivoted to use a second source of her power, the Republicans in the state legislature began to threaten to withhold funding. So they withheld the money that Congress gave from the December federal stimulus, and only recently have they voted to give $3.5 billion, but they tie-barred a bunch of that to Strickland County Health Department powers, so the governor had to veto it. So more than half of that money hasn't been given out. And then the Republicans threatened to withhold school funding, the basic lifeblood of local school districts, if they didn't reopen and have 20 hours and comply with a series of mandates. So what we're having is a bipartisan standoff between our state legislature, dominated by the Republicans, and our Democratic governor. And the harm is a huge change in public health policy that's putting us at the top of the list as worse now in the country just in the last month in terms of case rates. When we were near the top, we had the lower cases, we had less hospitalizations, we were doing better than other states. And I just wanted to lay that out for you.
Yeah, I have 3 brothers who live in Michigan. I have friends who live in Michigan, and there's a little listserv that a bunch of people that I went to college with have been talking about what you're talking about right now, although without all the detail. But their freak out is that case rates are exploding, and it seems to be tied to this forced reopening of the schools. And the thing that just to throw one more piece into this mix, Patrick, and this is research that is published but not yet peer-reviewed. So I put that caveat on, and I tweeted a link to the original research earlier today. And so if you want to track this down, it's on my Twitter feed at Thom_Hartmann. But the reason, now this is all subject to more science in the future, but it appears that the main reason why the COVID virus does not infect children, or rarely infects children, is that the principal vehicle that it uses to penetrate cells to produce an infection is a protein called ACE2. It's angiotensin. It's the angiotensin. I forget all the words, but angiotensin is this protein that the body produces that regulates blood pressure, and children don't produce this. It starts getting produced in puberty and after puberty. And the older you are, the more ACE2 receptors you have, and the more likely you are to have high blood pressure, and thus the more vulnerable you are to COVID infection. They used to think it was because children's immune systems were naive and just treated it as just another disease. They're increasingly thinking it's because kids don't have these ACE2 receptors. Well, this study that was just published, the title of it is the B1351 and the P1 variants extend SARS-CoV-2 host range to mice. And what they're pointing out is that these 2 mutations, the South African mutation, which is the P1, and I'm not sure what the other one is, these 2 mutations are now able to infect an animal that has no ACE2 proteins. It has no ACE2 receptors. And mice don't have this.
On your exact point, we have the B117 virus in Michigan. We have 15% of all cases. We have a greater number of those cases and a greater rate of growth than any state. And when the UK variant, the B117, which we now have in Michigan, largely from 3 prison outbreaks, but now it's spread throughout Washtenaw County. We have it all over Michigan State campus in East Lansing. Now that we have the B117 variant, we had a big outbreak in Livingston County. We believe that we're in a position like the Austrian study documented December 23rd that forced the rethinking in Germany and across Europe and in the UK, because that study, which was in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, showed that children were spreading at the same rate as adults. And they were showing
right, because these new variants don't require an ACE2 receptor in order to infect somebody.
So I don't know if you all are going to get the UK variant in other parts of the country, but we have it in Michigan, and it's changing the game for us.
Yeah, it's showing up all over the country. It's just that I think that we're, as a nation, in terms of the slope, the curve of spread of this virus, I think with these variants right now, we are where we were with the original wild virus back in April. And that's not a good place to be. Patrick, tip of the hat to you. Thank you so much for the information and a thoughtful and cogent and easily understood explanation of what's really a lot of fairly complex stuff. Thank you, Patrick. You did a real public service. I appreciate the call. We'll be right back. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls right after this. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where smart people get their news. Like Patrick. And welcome back. 45 minutes past the hour. And let's see here. Nancy in Chewella, Washington. Am I saying it right, Nancy? You are on the air.
Chewella. Close.
Chewella. Okay.
Okay.
What's up?
What I'm saying with gun violence and a lot of the problems that affect the poor and the minorities, and I've told you this, called you once before, and I'm a Democrat, but I grew up, my mother was dating a mob boss, not a mob boss, but a mafia guy from the time I was 9 till I was 19, and he said how it worked was they redline the neighborhood, they pour drugs into it if it's black or brown, and these people, you know, they die for it, they sell it, they go to jail for it, they use it, and the mob gets the money, and they do it in coordination with politicians and judges and cops, and he showed us photos of him shaking hands with these people. And this is the model across the country. Doesn't matter if it's blue or red. And this is they use the guns as genocide, the same way they're using COVID as genocide. And you pour the drugs in, you get the violence, and you get the gun violence. And as long as it stays in that area, nobody does anything. It's like what they do here to skunks. They live trap them, and then they pour water in and drown them. And this is what they're doing to poor people across the country. So they don't want to regulate guns at all, because even though a lot of these guns are coming in from other places or they're stolen or whatever, it's killing mostly the right people. And that's why they want to keep them out there.
Yeah. And you know, it sounds like a weird conspiracy theory, Nancy, but all the available consequence. I mean, if you look at what's actually happening, I can't dispute it. I can't dispute what you're saying.
Well, because the schools are so bad, too, that the kids, you know, they drop out, they don't learn anything, and then they're on the streets and adding to the gun violence, you know?
And you can take that back to Reaganism and Reagan's austerity. Nancy, thank you for the calls. Zenda in Seattle. Hey, Zenda, what's up?
Hi. Regarding the showing gun violence, I've watched lots of crazy violent movies, and I never get all upset about it. But when I see things on TV that are live action, I mean, like an accident or something, somebody being pulled out by the jaws of life, I get a visceral response. So I think the idea of saying that we are already, numb to it, I think that's wrong, and I think they should show the violence. Get Emmett Till back in today.
I'm sorry. Yeah. And I think that people are able to distinguish between a Bruce Willis movie and reality. You know, I think we have different kind of mental and emotional filters. We expect to see violence and sometimes even gratuitous violence. You go back to like the Kill Bill movies, but we still know these are actors. It's a movie. But when you see this happen in real life, and particularly children, it's a completely, Zenda, that's a really important point that you made, and I really appreciate you making it. Thank you so much for the call. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the top of the hour here. We'll be back in just a minute with more of your calls. Thom Hartmann here with you, exposing the con in conservative. 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. We'll be right back. The hidden history of the war on voting tells how the GOP has been stealing elections for decades and will again this year unless we stop them. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann taking your calls and thoughts. Charles in Miami. Hey, Charles, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Good.
Hello?
I'm great,
Hello?
Charles. I hope you are too.
Oh, yes. It's wonderful. I would like to say that lady, I really do believe what she's saying about organized crime and the Republicans. Well, she said the Democrats who will party. But the way the Republicans move, just the way they act, they just remind me of organized crime. But I wanted to call in today about these guns. And I wanted to say that Republicanism, conservatism, have led Americans to believe that, or at least their party members to believe that just as long as you have the money floating around in the system, in the government system, this is a fight. It all goes back to me still to civil rights and wanting to be on an equal plane. They're privileged, and they want to keep that privilege. I remember Mitch McConnell bragging that they wasn't going to work with Obama. And business had $2 trillion just sitting on the sideline offshore that they was going to hold back. I've always called you and I told you it seems like they have a shadow government here, these Republicans. And they just save up their war chest to keep it going. They don't want, they always defend tax cuts, but they're always unwavering on tax hikes. The evangelicalism that they promote, it rivals 16th century Catholicism. Martin Luther would be cursing from his grave right now. The police, who are like the palace guards, they're armed to the T with military-grade weapons. I remember they had a fight, and you talking about it, about PTSD. That's how I learned it from you back in the day. And, the Republicans not wanting to invest back into veterans. And I remember during the Obama presidency, when you had this veteran, he crossed over the line into Mexico. He was armed with an M6 with an AR-15, and guess what they did? They locked him up because they was like, we don't allow those type of weapons in Mexico. And coming and listening to the Fox News, they were saying, well, he only was. His mom said he was only walking around with that weapon. He was only allowed to walk around with that weapon because his doctors from the VA said that it was okay. So we have people walking around here with PTSD. We absolutely refuse people like Manchin and Sinema, who's been hiding in the background all this time. Thank goodness we have 50-50. And we can tell the Democrats that, that's on our side. But anyway, you have those people going with Republicans, refusing to fund the VA and veterans. These Republicans, they're like the Black Bart. They are like the real crooked guys in the old Western. And
it sure seems that way, Charles.
Yeah,
it sure does seem that way.
Basically, with
and I, going back to my rant in the first hour. I mean, I have yet to even be able to locate, a single Republican policy that actually benefits average Americans, working class Americans, poor Americans, anybody except the top 5% of Americans and explicitly the top 1% of Americans and the companies that make them rich. And I keep looking. Back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, at least Reagan and Bush tried to sell this stuff that we're now, been kneecapped by, Reaganomics. They tried to sell it as something that would help the average working person. Oh, if we just destroy the unions, if you don't have those union bosses taking money out of your paycheck every month, you're going to have more money. And how'd that work out, right? And if we give tax cuts to billionaires, they're going to have so much extra money that they'll want to raise your pay. And they, gullible people bought that stuff back in the 80s and 90s. But that's all the Republican Party has got, and they're still trying to sell it. And I'm just astonished that anybody is still buying it. Charles, you always say it so well. Thank you so much. Max in Clackamas, Oregon. Hey, Max, you're on the air. What's up? Max? I think Max might have hit the mute button on his phone by accident.
Can you hear me? Tom, hello?
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, yep. Well, you had asked earlier about if I had ever convinced a Republican colleague in regards to, a rational way of thinking about an issue. And I had a Republican coworker, Mark, who would sort of send me sort of swarmy memes, especially right before and after the previous election. But one thing he and I would debate about quite frequently was immigration. And my stance is that the people who are coming into the United States, illegally, quote unquote, they're doing that because the conditions they're fleeing are so unpalpable, so unbearable, and so desperate that they are willing to traverse, a desert and suffer, whatever consequences that might try to be enacted by a unsympathetic administration. Yeah. And he sent me a meme about something about, build the wall, et cetera. And sometimes you just have to reduce the thought into something as simple as a meme. And I sent him one back of Harriet Tubman escorting some enslaved people to safety in the North. And it said, sometimes the pathway to freedom isn't always a legal one. And that sort of put a new perspective on it to where he thought, it sort of opened his eyes. And so I just
we're talking about a relatively small number of people too, and frankly, we have fewer people coming to the United States and into the United States than we had a year ago. This is a seasonal thing. Every spring, in the late spring, early summer, every year, you see an influx of people coming into the United States, and many of them are looking for agricultural work. They're trying to get to California to pick crops. And, well, not just California, Texas as well, and parts of Arizona and New Mexico. And every fall, those numbers go back down again. But we have not yet hit the peaks that the Trump administration had in 2019. I mean, this goes, there's a great piece about this over at Daily Kos. This goes way back. In fact, I'd encourage you to check it out, Max. It may help you in your arguments with your friend. DAILYKOS.com. And the piece is titled, oh, that's not it. Okay, Juan Cole also wrote a great piece about this. You can find that over at commondreams.org. It's titled White Nationalist TV News. Even the networks and CNN are falling for the border crisis propaganda.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Gabi.com. Gabi takes the pain out of shopping for insurance. More info at Gabi.com/Tom. Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Help. More info at teethhealth.com, code Tom. HelloFresh, delivering fresh ingredients and mouthwatering recipes. More info at hellofresh.com, code Tom. Bowl and Branch, crafted for the common good. More information at bowlandbranch.com, code Tom. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More info at expressvpn.com/Tom. And CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code Tom.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur. This is a book that was written back in the late 90s, but it's still very, very timely. This is from the second chapter titled Class Antagonisms Inside the Fundamental Contradiction of National Oppression. Having just passed the 19th and quickly approaching the 20th anniversary of the LA Rebellion, we should be reminded here of what Rodney King whimpered as he stood in front of a bank of microphones surrounded by class enemies and neo-colonial politicians. We should remember how he'd been dressed in that non-threatening cardigan sweater, white shirt and black tie, how his hair had been tortured into submission by a jerry curl. We should reflect as well upon how timid and spooked he looked, and on how concerned and stern those who flanked him were as well. That was a Kodak moment. It was staged to foster an image of contrition and resignation, submission, a victim. Rodney King had been led to believe, through a bourgeois sense of reasoning, that the rebellion was really about him, that the reason new Africans and Mexicanos took to the streets of South Central was the result of his filmed beating. That, of course, is typical of mechanical bourgeois thinking. What it's not typical of, however, is someone from the hood. And this cuts both ways. No one in the hoods and barrios ever thought it was about Rodney King. We'd all seen the film over and over like everyone else, but that was par for the course. We'd always seen that, long before anybody caught it on tape. Actually, we'd experienced much more than that. Why, it's safe to say that the hoods had gone to war with each other in vicious waves of internal, intra-class combat for much less than that, though because of a general colonial mentality which prevents the challenging of bottom-up oppression, the same hood forces will not, in any systemic way, wage war on the pigs, or for freedom, land, and socialism. Rodney King alone, and of his own accord, would not have thought to hold a press conference to ask the asinine question in the form of a whimpering request, can't we just all get along? The fact of the matter is, we are getting along. New Africans and Mexicanos are getting along just fine. What we couldn't understand was why he was admonishing us for getting at the exploiters of our communities. The impression he gave, with his handler's hands up his back like a ventriloquist troll, was that a race riot was going on, as if we had all begun to kill each other or burn and rob each other's homes. His handlers compelled him to send up a false flag, a diversion. But you see, this was the very thing that exposed the class interests and reactionary politics of the Uncle Toms that had been designated to handle him, and by extension, us. Let's go back for a minute. Let's talk social development, aka history. There exists a fundamental contradiction in our lives that, like an elephant in the room, no one wants to acknowledge. As a consequence of the war waged upon various African nations by European powers, those of us captured and kidnapped were taken out of our own self-determining social developments and violently forced into Euro-American history. This is not simply a clever play on words. This is a reality. We lost the ability to control our own destiny. Read that again. From that time until now, the fundamental basic contradiction between the U.S. oppressor nation and our own oppressed and colonized nation has been the governing imperialist relationship, which is to say, us not being in control of the qualitative factors that determine our lives as a people, as a nation. Our tradition of struggle against this fundamental contradiction has taken many forms, some hidden or obscured, some open and hostile. But all of these have been open to resolve the fundamental contradiction and to regain our independence. While there have been some bona fide struggles to resolve the contradiction, there have also been reactionary neocolonial struggles waged by internal enemies loyal to the oppressor nation and culture that have tried time and time again to subvert and control our destiny for the benefit of the capitalists. They've come among us, always imposed from above, stirring up emotions and giving lip service to progress, equality, justice, and prosperity. These always within the colonial confines of the oppressor's arrangements, and none collectively ever materialize. Because without a resolution of the fundamental contradiction, that is the freeing of our productive forces from U.S. imperialism and the governing of our own affairs, we'll remain a minority within the American system as opposed to a majority in our own, and subjected to the established bourgeois social contract, i.e. colonialism, neo and post. We can parade all through the empire with black congressmen, black mayors, black governors, black police chiefs, black Supreme Court justices, hell, even a black president. And absolutely nothing will alter the genocidal relationship that governs our national oppression here, because the blacks are part of the colonial apparatus. They have made a strategic alliance with the capitalist imperialists to act as go-betweens in our oppression and exploitation. This is a conscious class stand. The black petty bourgeois is not innocently confused, like, say, Mrs. Jackson across the street is, about our national oppression, about the existence and subjugation of New Africa. They are well-read, have traveled in our experience. They've just chosen sides against us and in favor of our historical enemies. And the sooner we recognize and internalize this, the better off we'll be. Black ain't nothing but a color. As a designation of our national identity, it has played out. It is a superficial understanding at best and a foolish and dangerous analysis at worst. We have no collective control over the qualitative factors which determine our lives. We do not, in other words, control our destiny, not as a people or a state. The book is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Welcome to our third hour of our program. On the line with us is Debbie Hines. We haven't talked to Debbie in quite a while, and I'm so glad to have her back. She's a trial lawyer, legal and political commentator, former prosecutor. In fact, she served as the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Maryland earlier in her career. Her website is IamDebbieHines, DebbieHines.com, and her Twitter handle is also IamDebbieHines. And hello, Debbie. Welcome back.
Hey, Tom. Long time no speak. It's great being back.
Hello? Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad. I'm wondering if we've got some latency here. If we do, I'll check it out while we're talking. Tell us about what's the latest in the Derek Chauvin trial, the police officer who murdered George Floyd. And also, you wrote a piece or this blog post, Derek Chauvin defense versus justice for George Floyd, worded another way, the innocence of whiteness justification, essentially. Tell us about the details of the trial and also this perspective that you're bringing to this.
So here's the thing, Tom. The trial is going to start on Monday. It's going to start with jury selection. They actually have a jury that's already been seated. We know a little bit about the jury. It's so far it's 12 men and women, and it's 3 alternates. It looks like it's fairly diverse. At the end of the day, right now, we actually don't know what's the racial makeup of the actual 12 jurors that are going to hear the case, although it's the whole 15 is a diverse group. But, here's the thing. This case is something that just about everyone has seen the video of. I mean, one of the jurors, there's only one juror that said he or she had not seen the video. But everybody has seen the video of Mr. Floyd being pinned down for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he screamed out 30 times that he couldn't breathe. And so on the one hand, when you're looking at it that way, you would think like, oh, well, they just have to go through the formalities. We live in a world where we do have a justice system and someone has to be brought before trial and the jury has to hear the evidence and convict them, but this should be really a slam dunk case for the prosecution. But at the end of the day, it really is not, and that's because of a lot of different intricate issues, and primarily the issue of race and whiteness in America, that it's not going to be that easy for the prosecution to get a conviction. So Derek Chauvin is charged with second-degree and third-degree murder and manslaughter. And in my piece that I wrote, I still disagree, and I really feel that he should have been charged with first-degree murder. I understand that the prosecutor not that they did not feel that necessarily that the facts justified it, but I think they felt that they would not be able to get a conviction on first-degree murder. But really, as a former prosecutor, if this is not a case of first-degree murder, which carries a maximum penalty of life in prison, there really isn't any case. I mean, most prosecutors have gotten, most first-degree murder cases where it's a shooting and the person shoots at someone 8 times, because we say each and every time that you pulled the trigger, that was your building and making your intent. And so what's going to be argued is by the defense. And this is an interesting argument, and even though it seems maybe ludicrous to those that are viewing or listening in, it could resonate with white people or white jurors. They're saying that, well, Mr. Floyd, when you look at the autopsy report, because that's what the case hinges on, we're looking at the autopsy report, and they're saying that, well, Mr. Floyd did not die as a result of what Derek Chauvin did, okay? That he died because he had heart issues and he had other issues. He was COVID-19 positive at the time. He was a sickle cell trait. He has all these other things going on in his body, and that's really what caused him to die. The reason why they're saying that is because the state medical examiner's report basically says that, unlike what we saw on the video, that Mr. Floyd did not die by strangulation, by being choked to death, but he died as a result of his heart just giving out on him. And then the other factors of being strangled are contributing significant factors involved. That's certainly not what the independent medical examiner found, but that's not going to be the one that's presented by the prosecutor. The independent medical examiner found that Mr. Floyd died as a result of strangulation. So what the defense is going to argue for the white police officer is basically that Mr. Floyd was the one who was guilty of anything, that he had a prior arrest back in 2009, which the judge is going to allow in. And in that prior arrest, it was a drug arrest. And so they're just going to try to paint a very negative picture of Mr. Floyd and to basically say that, well, he had drugs in his system, he was a drug addict, and all of these other things could have killed him. But I want the jury to basically come in there, as every jury is instructed to, with your own common sense. And so for them to say, use their defense and say what they're saying, it basically means that if this was back in the day in the not-so-distant past, if this was a lynching, an actual hanging of a black man, and the white defendant, if there were ever such one on trial, would say, oh, he didn't die because he was hanged to death from the tree. He really died because he was overweight, he had diabetes, he had heart conditions, and he had everything else in the world. That's really their defense. But it boils down to, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the video and what you saw happen, or are you going to believe the white man and give him the benefit of the doubt?
Yeah, we've come a long way since 1955 when, after Emmett Till was brutally murdered by two white men down in Mississippi, they held a trial, and in 1 hour the jury returned a not guilty verdict on these two white men, and one of the jurors said, we would have done it a lot earlier if we hadn't taken a break to have a soda. I mean, that was justice in 1955 for white people who killed black people. It seems like we've come a long way, but this racialized these racialized killings, I'm lacking of a word here, Debbie. Maybe you could fill it in. Are still happening. I really honestly don't believe that even Derek Chauvin, even if he's, some sort of homicidal maniac, would have done this to a white guy, particularly a white guy who was well dressed. I can't even imagine it would have happened. And it's like, when do we reach the point, and we have about a minute and a half left here, Debbie, before we're going to hit a hard break. When and how does America reach the point where justice is based on the crime, not the victim of the crime?
Well, that's the question we've been asking for the last over 400 years. When does that happen? When is it a time that black people in America can get justice, not just in the case of police killings, but within the entire criminal justice system? When does that happen? And I don't really see it. I see it a little different. I don't see it as things have changed really that much, because if you look at 30 years ago, that was the Rodney King case. That was the first case that was allegedly on video by a bystander. And although Mr. King did not die, he was brutally beaten to death. And in the first trial against those four police officers, they found those white officers not guilty for a beating that took 12 minutes, almost really longer than George Floyd. So, when you look at the things that have happened, it's not like we're in the 50s. It didn't change that much with Rodney King, and we saw Eric Garner die on the video too, and they didn't even bring charges with respect to him. So I'm kind of beg to differ that I don't really see things as being changed. I think they're different in how, white people are going about it, particularly white police officers, but I don't really see it being that much of a change, sadly.
So we have 30 seconds. What do we do to bring about that change, Debbie?
We have to change the system, and we don't have much time in 30 seconds, but we have to overhaul the entire system. We cannot give police officers a pass. We cannot, in the civil system, give them qualified immunity, so if they don't go to jail, they don't even suffer not a penny out of their pocket. The entire system has to be changed. I'm with you. I'm absolutely with you. Debbie, thank you for dropping by. It's always great talking with you. Debbie Hines. Same here.
My pleasure. I am Debbie Hines, DEBBIEHINES.com is Debbie's website, and it's also her Twitter handle. I am Debbie Hines, and she's just brilliant. Thank you so much, Debbie. It's great having you with us. We'll be back, and we'll continue our conversations of the day right after this. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's your media support group for democracy in America, We the People. We'll be right, all of us. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Leo in Portland. Hey, Leo, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Hey, how are you, Tom? I just wanted to tell you I loved your rant today, and you must have been reading my mind with the book reading. When you asked, how come people don't have common sense? How come the Republicans don't see the writing on the wall, of their actions? And I would drill down further to the root cause of that, which I feel there's no coincidence that the Bible thumpers overlap with the GOP party and especially the Trumpers. They've been brainwashed in the doctrine of blind faith and just going along with what they're told, no matter how outlandish or ridiculous it is. They believe in trickle-down economics, the way they think, giving money to the church will somehow make their life better. I think it all boils down to religion, because when you ask why were the founding fathers were white supremacists, and I would counter is, why were they white supremacists? It's because they were Puritans and very Jesus-y, and my God is better than your God, and if you're black, you don't have the real God in my so that justifies rape, slavery, child molesting, killing. Religion is, I feel, the basis of all these problems. And I hate it when Biden and Harris and, we can't have an atheist president, when they say, oh, I'm a man of faith, and they proclaim that proudly. It's like, that really loses points with me. We're supposed to be a government, separate from the church. And I don't want you to believe in mythology. I want you to believe in, math and science. And, when they say, it's just the way of the times, and hopefully we can move beyond religion. And I think that's when we'll actually address all the race issues, all the economic inequality. I think all of that can be addressed by not having a class system that's based on my God is better than your God.
Yeah, I'm with you, Leo. And let me put a punctuation mark on your rant. The two people among the founders who were the most outspoken against slavery were Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine. And both were proudly atheists. As were many of the small d Democratic founders. Were at the very least deists. They just kind of believe something created the universe, but ever since then it's just run based on natural law. But Thomas Paine actually wrote a book in defense of atheism, and that book got him basically purged in the United States. I mean, people just hated him for that book. And I think it's called The Age of Reason, as I recall. And it was a defense of atheism and an attack on Christianity. And because he published that book, only 7 people showed up at his funeral. I mean, he was collapsed as one of the founders from a very, very high position, as one of the people who was really viewed as, having kicked off the revolution with his pamphlet Common Sense, to being, despised because religion had so much power in the United States in that decade after the 1800s, or after the election of 1800. Leo, I got to run, but thank you. Good rant. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. The Hidden History of Monopoly tells how Robert Bork, yeah, that guy from the Reagan era, transformed corporate America and destroyed the American dream. Hey, it's 20 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Nancy in Minneapolis. Hey, Nancy, what's on your mind today?
So I was brought up Republican like you. I'm your age. And I didn't catch on as fast as you did. I voted for Nixon and defended Nixon during Watergate. But I was lucky enough to marry a Democrat and be surrounded by people that kept on asking me questions. Well, what about this and what about that? And I would twist myself into pretzels answering that. And I also had the privilege of living abroad, which let me see what socialism was like. That was very helpful. I think the turning point for me is what? Minneapolis.
No, I mean when you lived abroad.
In Australia. I lived in Australia.
Yeah,
so
where they have a national healthcare system. It works very well. Yeah.
Yes. Right. And realizing that right wing meant monarchy, meant dictatorship, and left wing meant the people had power. Then my husband asked me one day, what was Nixon? What will Nixon be remembered for? My head said Watergate. My mouth said he opened up China. My husband was so disgusted, he just turned away. And then I realized, Nancy, you're lying to yourself. You are lying. You're not even telling the truth to yourself. And then I started to re-examine myself of what the heck I was doing.
So you had a road to Damascus epiphany, as it were.
Sure.
After an accumulation of experience that taught you that what you had believed as a Republican was wrong. That's a fascinating story. Nancy, thank you for calling and sharing it with us.
Thank you.
It's very, very considerate of it. Thank you. It's great talking with you. Matt in Augusta, Georgia. Hey, Matt, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. That was a great rant this morning, and it was a brilliant letter. But, yes, I come from a Republican family, too, and they do believe all of that. And what has happened, from what I can tell, is because they believe all of that stuff, they don't believe in living in a constitutional democracy anymore, and they don't believe in living in a civilized society. 21st graders get shot, and they dig in even more. Black people are getting shot on camera, and they dig in even more. Naked fascism has taken hold, and they just simply don't believe in a constitutional democracy or living in a civilized society.
And I think that this is a disease that is largely limited to white people and largely limited to, frankly, racists. The one thing that the Republican Party has been offering white people in America since Richard Nixon's Southern strategy got him elected in 1968, the one thing that the Republican Party has offered white people is the ability to trash or kill or brutalize or keep out of the neighborhood or keep out of the workplace black people. And it's just like that is the one thing. And it's why Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where, near where Schwermer, Cheney, and Goodman were murdered, the civil rights workers in the 60s. That's where he went to give his first speech. It's why Donald Trump Jr. went to the exact same place, the Nebosha, or however you say it, county fair, and spoke to an all-white audience and said the same thing. And beyond that, beyond white people who are just plain old flat out racist, whether they're willing to say it out loud or not, I can understand, if somebody's going to bind themselves to the Republican Party because they're racist, well, at least that's an honest answer, right? But all these other things, we think the Republicans are going to help working people. We think that more guns is going to make a safer society. We think that doing away with Social Security and Medicare will lift people up. We think that doing away with food stamps and unemployment benefits will cause people to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. All these things have been just so thoroughly debunked by 40 years of experience that I think all they're left with is that if you're a Republican, you get to hate on black people and brown people and Asian people and trans people and pick your minority.
Yeah, 1930s Germany.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, sadly,
Right.
yeah, that was the same thing. They were.
Roots in racism.
Absolutely.
If I'm saying that right.
Yeah, you are. Matt, thank you very much. I appreciate the call. Daniel in Manchester, New Hampshire. Hey, Daniel, thanks for listening to iHeartRadio. What's up?
Yes, sir. So I wanted to call about, you had a woman on talking about the Chauvin trial, and I'm trying to get the point across to anybody who will listen. Police are part of the emergency medical services, right? They're there along with the fire department and EMTs and paramedics, right? I was both an EMT and a firefighter, and we don't have qualified immunity. As a matter of fact, we are held to a higher standard. So it makes no sense.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so like, well, you actually, you passed, you went through the police academy, so I'm not sure you would qualify anymore, but like the average untrained citizen is protected by what's called Good Samaritan laws. So if you step in and you try to help somebody and you actually do something detrimental to them, you're protected. You can't be sued. Unless, of course, you tried to hurt them. But if you tried to help somebody, you're protected.
I get it. Daniel, you're fading out here.
I'm sorry. The kid that was killed with ketamine, I don't know why they're not in trial, because everybody, like, I can give ketamine, and or I used to be able to give ketamine, and you know how much to give based on the body weight. And if they gave him too much ketamine, that's easily, like, you can't get out of that. You know, so
and as an EMT or a firefighter, you don't have the qualified immunity the police do, even though you're not carrying a gun, but you are carrying a syringe. I mean, you can kill people intentionally or by accident. Daniel, that's fascinating. It just hadn't occurred to me. I didn't realize. Thank you very much. It's a great argument for ending qualified immunity for police in the United States, and saying that the courts can be an avenue of redress, as it were. We'll be back. We're hitting the bottom of the hour here, back on the other side of this break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Speaking the truth, the multinational corporations who own the Republican Party would really rather you didn't know all about. We'll be right back.
Our book today is The Poisoned City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy by Anna Clark. This is from the prologue. On a hot day in the summer of 2014 in the Civic Park neighborhood where Pastor R. Sherman McCathern preached in Flint, Michigan, water rushed out of a couple of fire hydrants. Puddles formed on the dry grass and splashed the skin of the delighted kids who ran through it. But the spray looked strange. The water was coming out dark as coffee for hours, McCathern remembered. The shock of it caught in his throat. Something is wrong here. Something had been wrong for months. That spring, Flint, under the direction of state officials, turned off the darkening water that it had relied on for the drinking water that it had relied on for nearly 50 years. The city planned to join a new regional system called the Carignondi Water Authority, and while it waited for the KWA to be built, it began bringing in its water from the Flint River. McCathern didn't pay much attention to the politicking around all this. He had enough to worry about with his busy parish. But after the switch, many of his neighbors grew alarmed at the water that flowed from their kitchen faucets and shower heads. They packed public meetings, wrote questioning letters, and protested at City Hall. They filled clear plastic bottles from their taps to show how the water looked brown or orange and sometimes had particulates floating in it. Showering seemed to be connected with skin rashes and hair loss. The water smelled foul. A sip of it put the taste of a cold metal coin on your tongue. But the authorities said everything was all right and you could drink it, so people did, McCathern said later. Residents were advised to run their faucets for a few minutes before using the water to get a clean flow. But as the months went by, the city plant tinkered with treatment and issued a few boil water advisories. State environmental officials said again and again that there was nothing to worry about. The water was just fine. Whatever their senses told them, whatever the whispers around town, whatever Flint's troubled history with powerful institutions telling them what was best for them, this wasn't actually hard for people like McCathern to believe. Public water systems are one of this country's most heroic accomplishments, a feat so successful that it's almost invisible. By making it a commonplace for clean water to be delivered to homes, businesses, and schools, we have saved untold lives from what today sound like antiquated diseases in a Charles Dickens novel: cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. Here in Flint, it was instrumental in turning General Motors, founded in 1908 in Vehicle City, as the town was known, into a global economic giant. The advancing underground network of pipes defined the growing city and its metropolitan region, which boasted of being home to one of the strongest middle classes in the entire United States. McCathern is a tall, bald man with a thin mustache and a scratchy rasp in his baritone voice. At the time of the water switch, he had led the non-denominational Joy Tabernacle Church for about 15 years. It was founded in the YMCA in downtown Flint, where it held baptisms in the swimming pool. But in 2009, it made a home in Civic Park, where a Presbyterian church closed after 85 years and gave its sanctuary over to the young and hopeful congregation. By then, Civic Park, one of America's oldest subdivisions, was a desert of deserted, historically significant homes, the pastor said. Built between 1917 and 1919 by General Motors and DuPont and Company, along curving tree-lined boulevards, the tidy houses were designed for Flint's auto workers and their families. But over the years, the neighborhood was blighted by vacancy. Empty two-stories with lurching front porches and crumbling roofs sat alongside crisply painted homes where Flint residents, they sometimes call themselves Flintoids or Flintstones, still live their lives. When the sound of gunshots on the street outside interrupted services, McCathern gave a nod to the church musicians, urging them to play louder. Some called Joy Tabernacle a thug church, he said, but McCathern saw the good. The young men filling his pews built a proud society, if not by getting their names on the honor roll, then by tagging their names with spray paint. In the end, people just want to be seen. The ghosts of the past went well beyond Civic Park. Between General Motors and the United Auto Workers, the city had been a flourishing hub for American innovation. There were more than 100 different manufacturing establishments in town. 10 of them employed at least 1,000 people each. And they not only made automobiles, but paints, varnishes, tools, dyes, cotton, textiles, and a wealth of other products. Flint had one of the highest per capita incomes in the entire nation. And despite being severely segregated, it was a magnet for African-American migrants from the South. When Vice President Hubert Humphrey stopped by during the campaign for the 1964 presidential election, he praised Flint for, quote, zooming ahead with unbelievable growth and progress. Workers earned wages that are very good, Humphrey said, and, quote, because of the great labor management program in the community over many years, there has been a constant rise in the standard of living, end quote. Away from the assembly lines and the executive suites, the people of Flint felt that the city just shouldn't be a place to work. It should also be a place to thrive. Charles Stewart Mott, an auto pioneer who became GM's single largest stockholder and three-term mayor, created a nationally renowned community schools program that provided education, skills-building workshops, and social influence and social services. The book, The Poison City.
This week on The Science Revolution is Dr. Justin Frank, author of the Trump, Obama, and Bush on the Couch series of books. He's here on how to deal with the trauma of the pandemic and the trauma of 4 years of Trump. It's been a stressful time. Some of us have lost family and friends and have found it difficult to stay safe and pay the bills. The Trump years have been a challenge to democracy and our sanity. Dr. Justin Frank is here to help. Tune into The Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. 34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. President Joe Biden just finished his, or just a little while ago, finished his first press conference. And, of course, the Republican knives are already out, but I'll just give you a quick recap of the things that he said. I'm getting this largely from the Washington Post because his press conference happened while I was on the air. He started out by announcing that he is doubling his vaccine goal. He wanted to have 100 million people vaccinated by 100 days. And keep in mind, the population of the U.S. is around 340 million. He's now setting his goal for the first 100 days as 200 million people. And I think that there's a chance he'll hit that. So that's number one. Number two, he says he's going to take big issues one by one. And the Republican Party can join in. You know, hey, we welcome their participation. Let's solve the problems of America. Or they can continue the politics of division, his phrase, which I thought was brilliant. He went on to say that the filibuster has been abused and he supports revamping it so that he can get his agenda items passed. There's a variety of ways to do that. He said, I believe we should go back to the position on the filibuster that existed just when I came to the United States Senate decades ago, which is that you must speak while you're doing a filibuster. This is the so-called talking filibuster. When he was asked about the so-called surge at the border, he pointed out that this happens every year around this time of year, more people are coming right now, not because he's a nice guy, but because this is just, what always happens. He was asked if May 1st was, in fact, going to be a hard deadline for U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, and he said that's going to be a challenge. But, quote, it is not my intention to stay there for a long time, end quote, and that he, quote, can't picture, end quote, troops still being there in a year. He said, my answer is that it's going to be hard to meet the May 1 deadline in terms of tactical reasons, hard to get those troops out. If we leave, we're going to do it in a safe and orderly way. We're in consultation with our allies and partners. Keep in mind, he's only been in office a couple of months, and Trump had just gutted the State Department, the Justice Department, the EP. I mean, pick your federal agency. They were just, and so it's a tough one. He says he's not going to take a harder line on unaccompanied minors. With regard to North Korea, he said that the United States will respond to North Korea's launch of 2 ballistic missiles if they escalate their threats. He said, quote, I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization. So that's what we're doing right now, he said. So basically what he said is if North Korea is willing to get rid of their nukes, we're willing to come a long way in their direction. That's going to be a tough one. It's going to be a very tough one. But, who knows? When he was asked about all these efforts, we have now 43 states where Republicans have introduced legislation to make it harder for people to vote. He said that's sick. He said it's sick. It's sick. In fact, he said it twice. He said, I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this because it's the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. And said he's going to do everything he can to pass legislation to protect voting rights in America. He agrees with Obama that the filibuster is a relic of the Jim Crow era. He made news. He said he's going to run for re-election, or he plans to run for re-election in 2024. He'll be 82 years old that year, 81 or 82. I'm not sure if he just turned 74 or 78, rather, or if he's been that. I don't recall when his birthday is, frankly, but he'll be in his 80s. And he said that it's his expectation that he's going to run, number one, and number two, that it's his expectation that Kamala Harris will be his running mate. When they were asked who he thought he would run against, he said, and I quote, oh, come on, I don't even think about it. I have no idea. I have no idea whether there'll be a Republican Party. Do you? Brilliant. He insisted that China will play by international rules. We'll see how that plays out. He said that President Xi is a smart guy who doesn't have a Democrat with a small d bone, a Democratic bone in his body. He's one of the guys like Putin who thinks that autocracy is the wave of the future. That's what Joe Biden said today. And so, that's, I think, a pretty reasonable summary, I hope, a pretty reasonable summary of, what he did with his press conference. So back to your phone calls. Excuse me. Let's see here. Latham in Ozona, Texas. Am I saying that right?
Hey, Tom. Yes, and it's actually Latham, but that's okay.
Latham. Okay. What's up?
Hey, Tom. I just want to start off. I'm going to be quick and concise. I don't particularly identify with a Democratic or Republican Party. I'm a farmer and rancher out in West Texas in the border region, and I just wanted you and your listeners to hear this. And take it as you will. There actually is a situation on the border. Now, I'm not in the Border Patrol. I'm not in Homeland Security, so I don't have any facts. But what I do have is what I see. And for years and years now, people have been coming across the border, not only through port of entry, but, across the country, across the Rio Grande and so forth. We see evidence of it all the time in our rural homes. Property is stolen. Now, not all of these people are malicious or bad, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's a ton of people coming over that are, basically undocumented, via the port of entry. This is a human safety issue for not only the citizens of the United States, but also for those people that are trying to come here for whatever reason that may be. Two instances. One, a friend of mine near Laredo, Texas, he runs a ranch down there. On a daily basis, especially since right around October, November of 2020, they are coming across over 300 people a day on this ranch. They're stove up in barns, abandoned vehicles, and, hiding, essentially, just trying to get from point A to point B. Another instance, a friend of mine in Alpine, Texas, a group of over 800.
Latham, what's your point?
Coming.
I'm sure that you could tell stories all day long, but what's the point you're trying to make?
I guess the point I'm trying to make is that that there actually is an issue, and a lot of times
I don't think anybody's disputing that.
No, of course not. Of course not. I just wanted the listeners and you, of course, to know what kind of maybe a firsthand experience is.
Okay, I got it. I got it. It seems to me like we need to have a number. I think the multiple steps that are being taken right now. Number one, we messed up Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador in the 80s when Reagan went in and just blew up those three countries that at the time were functioning democracies, brought death squads. He sent John Negroponte down into El Salvador with death squads. The murder of the nuns in Honduras, all this kind of stuff because, oh my God, they wanted to give everybody in the country free health care. So we've got some work to do down there, some repair work. Number two, you've got global climate change that is increasing desertification, the progress of the desert, which is making it harder to grow crops and driving people off small family farms, subsistence farming in all three of those countries and in southern Mexico. And these are regional issues to the Americas, to North and Central America that we need to be part of the solution to, that were completely ignored during the 4 years of the Trump administration and frankly have been largely ignored for decades. So number one, we've got to deal with that. Number one, we've got to deal with the democracy issue in these countries. Number two, we've got to deal with the global warming and essentially refugee crisis in these countries. And number three, Trump ripped apart our system for asylum and refugees. People coming into the United States and asking for asylum, asserting that they are refugees, is a completely different thing legally in this country and around the world. It's a completely different thing from somebody coming across the border saying, I want to get a good job so I can send money home to my family. That latter category, the people who are coming for jobs, the way you stop them from coming is real simple. You start putting rich white employers in jail for hiring people who are not citizens. But that's not the crisis that we're facing right now. That's almost a straw man argument. The real crisis we're facing is people who are literally refugees. They're escaping gang violence or they're escaping literally starvation. And we've got to figure out a way to deal with this that is humane, but also that doesn't compromise the integrity of the United States as a country and our border. And that absolutely requires that we be working in particular with Mexico, but also with Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And that's the job that 3 days ago Joe Biden gave to Kamala Harris. We have apparently a brand new tradition in America. It started with President Obama's presidency, I think you could argue, of at the very, very highest levels of when Republicans screw up things really badly, we hire a black person to fix the problem. And so Kamala Harris is going to solve this problem. And obviously it's a large, complex problem that has been festering for decades, and it's not going to be solved quickly. But, I get it that there's a real issue. Latham, thank you for the call. It's nice to hear from you. I just noticed I have 30 seconds left. I could have. But this we have to deal with these issues honestly. And the problem that we're facing right now is that one of our two political parties does not want to deal with these problems honestly. It simply wants to use them as something to beat. You know, the Republicans want to use the quote problem of brown people crossing the border to beat up Democrats as a way of tossing red meat to their white racist base. It's pretty much the only way you can explain the way that they're unwilling to deal with actual solutions. And during the Trump administration, 4 years of the Trump administration, no conversation with these southern countries outside of this weird thing with Mexico.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Which was basically, we'll give you a little money if you'll build some homeless camps on the border. And yeah, we just stored up the problem for Biden. And welcome back. Let's see here. Steve in Topanga, California. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Hey, good morning, Tom. I want to make the observation that, when I first saw the images of the death camps in Nazi Germany being liberated, and, it just really impacted me, and it's stuck with me all these years. And I'm thinking, I think we should show the pictures of the carnage when people go after, shoot up a supermarket or a school. I think people need to see that. And that's basically my point. We've just sanitized too much stuff. And, there's words you can't say. We got to get right down to the meat of it. And the Republicans are a death cult. And we should show what
no, there are words you can't say because they are harmful and hurt other people. But that's a completely different thing from not showing the pictures. And that's about trying to protect people. I mean, the reason why our media doesn't show these gory pictures is because they're trying not to promote gratuitous violence, and they're also trying not to trigger people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, people who might have been victims of crimes. And I totally get that. Steve, thank you. I'm with you. Kendall in Enza, California. Hey, Kendall, what's up?
Good morning, Tom. First-time caller. Absolutely loved your rant today. One of the best in a long time. We should stop tiptoeing around calling out only Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and we must include Israel in our list of contributing bots and trolls influencing our internal destruction. I once had sympathy for Israel. My father fought in the Battle of the Bulge. We give them billions every year. As Seth Abramson reveals in his profound book, Proof of Conspiracy, cyber warfare groups like Terragence, Black Cube Academy, Blackwater, Flynn Intel Group, all have deep Israeli ties with Mossad and the Israeli Defense Force. All are marketing influencers, digital marketing campaigners that use disruptive technologies. Remember, Israel is running the world's largest open-air concentration camp, restricting food and medicine on a barely survivable level.
Yeah. In Gaza.
Peaceful Palestinians.
I got it, Kendall. I got it. And it looks to me like the good news is that Netanyahu is not going to be able to form a government, and Benny Gantz may be the next prime minister. And, I think that there's still, yes, Israel is an apartheid society right now. And, it's not something that our media talks about much and people talk about in polite society. But the two parties that Netanyahu has aligned himself with, one is openly homophobic and racist, openly. The other is just, to the right of the Republican Party, and then you got Netanyahu. But it looks like he's not going to be able to pull together his coalition. And I think that would be a good thing for Israel and a good thing for the world. And I would love to see Israel cleaving to the values that it was founded on, to a large extent, in any regard, of pluralistic democracy and the values that in many ways were elevated through things like the kibbutz movement back in the day. I mean, I think that there's a lot of potential there, and it's a wealthy and competent country that produces some extraordinary technology. I didn't know that Israeli bots and Israeli influence machines are happening in the United States, the way that Russia's are. And I'll have to look at that because I can't confirm that. We'll be back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. So a while ago at Davos, Michael Dell, the computer billionaire who started out selling computers out of his dorm room in college. I was running CompuServe forums back in the day. This is in the late 70s or the early 80s, and he was selling them on CompuServe in my forums. And, now he's worth billions. And somebody asked him, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is proposing a 70% tax bracket for people who make the kind of money you make. What do you think of that? And his response was, a 70% tax rate? Name a country where that ever worked. Ever. And it turns out there is such a country, and apparently Michael Dell didn't know this. I think a lot of Americans don't know this, that there was a country that had its greatest period of prosperity in its entire history with a top tax rate that was above 70%. In fact, it hit 90% for more than half the time, and that was the United States of America. It's a new video over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Curtis in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Curtis, what's on your mind today?
Well, first of all, I've been hearing you talk about the death of truth. And I don't know many people, well, I'm 72, my age, that didn't see on Sesame Street how a bill gets done in Congress. I don't know many people that didn't witness the moon landing, and still they deny it. The Earth, like you were saying earlier, this Earth, the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth. I mean, what kind of thinking is that? And the last point I wanted to talk about is, is there a protocol where you can't call somebody on the Senate floor a liar?
Yes, there is, actually.
Why?
It's to, quote, maintain decorum, end quote. And basically what it is it forbids what are called ad hominem attacks. You can attack the idea. You can say that argument that you just made is based on a lie. You can say that. But you cannot say you as a human being are a liar. I'm not really all that opposed to that rule. I pretty much follow that rule on this program. I generally don't attack people as people, but rather attack their ideas. I think that's probably not a bad thing. Although it's fairly obvious that there are a bunch of liars in the United States Senate. Pardon my interruption,
absolutely. No, you're right. There are a bunch of liars in the United States Senate. Now, you talk about the freedom of speech and the decorum and all that. Where is the responsibility of speech? Where is it that you are held accountable for what you say? And I don't mean calling you a liar, but if that's what you're doing, you're a liar. You can't say that the sun revolves. That the sun revolves around the earth. That's not true. Now, if you keep on saying that, somebody's got to tell you, hey, look, you're lying. That's not the truth. That's not science. Yeah. Here's the facts. Stop it. But we don't.
I'm with you.
Here because... Go ahead. You got me on.
I'm completely with you, Curtis.
So
and I think you can draw a straight. I agree, and I think you can draw a straight line from Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and a few others. And we're talking senators here, saying that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him, or there were all these problems and voter fraud and quack, 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 after all these states did all their investigations and all the courts did all their investigations. Everybody said everything was on the up and up. I think you can draw a direct line from that to the death of 7 people on January 6th. There is a consequence of January 6th, and to the absolute assault on democracy itself. Curtis, spot on. Thank you very much for the call. Erwin in Missoula, Montana. Hey, Erwin, what is on your mind today?
Yes, thank you. I was wanting to connect with what you were talking yesterday about the sanitation, and with gun culture in America tied to the military. I remember growing up playing World War II, using imaginary 50 caliber machine guns, flamethrowers, etc. And it seemed like during the Vietnam War, that mystique was gone. But then with the Gulf War and the following wars, with the sanitation, what brought this call up is because sniper rifles. I've been looking on what's like in outdoor magazines. That's the big thing right now. It seems like the military mystique is tied to the weapons and not just the weapon itself. And
yeah, I think so. And to the sale of these weapons as the thing you need to have to prove you're masculine. Erwin, thank you. Sandra in Guadalajara, Mexico. Hey, Sandra, we have a little less than a minute left.
Tom,
you got a quick point?
Yes, I just want to comment on the speech and the question and answer that Biden had to go through with all the got you questions, and how wonderful he brought everything to the point and know what direction that we're going to be going in our country. And I think it's just wonderful. And I'm even enjoying listening to what do you call it? When they have every day the young lady that does what do you call it?
Oh, the press conferences, Jen Petsky.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm looking at this every day, and it's just absolutely wonderful. Then I come over to you, and I get a straight point. So down here in Guadalajara, it's wonderful. And I'm an ex-merchant Marine.
Oh, that's
very
great.
well
Sandra,
down.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I've got to run. It's the end of the show. But thank you so much for the call, and I hope you call again and we can talk longer. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll see you tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Be good to yourself and the people around you, huh?
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Gabi.com. Gabi takes the pain out of shopping for insurance. More info at Gabi.com/Tom. Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Help. More info at teethhealth.com, code TOM. HelloFresh, delivering fresh ingredients and mouthwatering recipes. More info at hellofresh.com, code TOM. Bowl and Branch, crafted for the common good. More information at bowlandbranch.com, code TOM. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More info at expressvpn.com/Tom. And CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM.
We say fight back!
Bye.